Tulane University, Vines and Gordon, tell us this: the constitutional system of checks and balances was designed to ensure cooperation between the branches of federal government. This cooperative concept of governmental separation of powers is particularly important in foreign relations because all Americans recognize today that foreign policy decisions represent life and death issues. It's because Gary and I believe that the responsibility for certain foreign policy decisions is too great to entrust to a single individual. We propose today that executive control of United States foreign policy should be significantly curtailed. In analyzing the proposition, Gary and I will concern ourselves with current methods of policy formulation and implementation. And because we believe that the affirmative proposal offers a situation which would be comparatively advantageous to the present approach, we offer the following two-point plan defining the terms empirically. Number one, no United States troops may be sent overseas without the consent of the Senate. No U.S. troops sent overseas without Senate consent. Number two, a senatorial committee comprised of 3 elected members of the majority party, 2 elected members of the minority party, shall be empowered to grant emergency powers to the President. That's a senatorial committee, 3 elected members of the majority party, 2 from the minority party, shall be empowered to grant emergency powers to the President. In support of this proposal, we offer the following 2 comparative advantages. Number one, the affirmative proposal would provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention. The affirmative proposal will provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention. And number 2, the affirmative proposal will better secure a truly national policy. Let's turn our attention to the first area of comparative advantage, that the affirmative proposal would provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention. Now, Gary and I recognize, as I'm sure we all do, that the President's power to direct American forces anywhere in the world really ought to be, and nominally is, a power checked by another branch of government. Really, the gravity of the situation demands the presence of those checks. Senator Wayne Morse, speaking before Senate hearings July 20th, 1967, made this observation: more in foreign policy and in war than in any other endeavor. More today than ever before, the United States government and its people should adhere to the constitutional principle of separation of powers. We are in a nuclear age, where decisions made in haste or in error by one individual can bring ruin to a nation, misery and hopelessness to its people, and produce mountains of debt. Gary and I will not argue that checks do not exist today. We realize that it was the intent of the constitutional framers that the President be checked. We further realize that nominal checks do exist today. What we are going to suggest is that a detailed examination of the 2 most widely recognized checks will demonstrate the comparative advantage that rests in the affirmative proposal. Those checks are congressional resolutions and the power of appropriations. First of all, congressional resolutions. Some insist that these resolutions, which express the opinion of the House or the Senate, can be used to thwart an undesirable presidential policy. 2 points need to be made. The first is that these resolutions cannot compel a change because they lack legal binding effect. The second point is that these resolutions constitute only an ex post facto check. Charles O. Lurch of the Washington Institute for Foreign Affairs underlined each point in his book, Foreign Policy of the American People. He tells us this: a resolution expressing the sense of the House or the Senate without legal effect serves notice that the congressional mind has been made up. Such resolutions are most effective when they are passed prior to the making of a firm commitment by the executive. Gary and I are going to suggest that when the executive has already made the commitment, when the troops are already overseas, that the power of congressional resolutions cannot constitute a check as effective as that of the affirmative proposal. Senator Roman Hruska of Nebraska, before Senate hearings July 19, 1967, concluded the point: the President has, in many cases, committed armed forces to military action without congressional approval, leaving absolutely no choice to the Congress but to go along with his proclaimed policy. The second check to be examined is that of appropriations. Some insist that the appropriations check is the most effective because if Congress doesn't agree with the presidential option, they may simply vote to remove the funds necessary to carry it out. One thing is obvious from the outset. That is that the power of appropriations is an ex post facto check. Gary and I feel that there are 2 factors which preclude appropriations from being the effective check. Number 1 is the understandable reluctance of congressmen to commit political suicide by voting against proclaimed presidential policy. Paul Findley, congressman from Illinois, before Senate hearings July 21, 1967, explains the peculiar position he finds himself in. The need for the president to go to Congress, he said, to finance and supply troops already overseas is not a sufficient break. Vietnam is an ideal example, because regardless of the basic war policy involved, what senator in his right mind is going to vote to cut off or limit the supplies necessary for the men in the field? Such a move would constitute political suicide. Second factor limiting the effectiveness of the appropriations check is the reluctance of congressmen to risk diplomatic defeat once the president has already made the commitment. Cecil Crabb, professor of political science at Vassar, in his book American Foreign Policy in the Nuclear Age, explains why. Congress can, of course, simply refuse to appropriate the funds. Such drastic action seldom occurs because Congress is as aware as the officials in the executive department of the gravity of situations prevailing in the international community. It has absolutely no desire to risk diplomatic defeat for the United States. We conclude for two reasons, then, that the check of appropriations cannot constitute a check as effective as that of the affirmative proposal. Cognizant of the necessity for meaningful checks on the president's power of military intervention, realizing that an examination of those checks indicates that there's a comparative advantage with the affirmative proposal, Gary and I asked the pertinent question: why not put the check where it can be most effective, in the policy formulation, implementation stage? The first comparative advantage is that the affirmative proposal would provide more effective checks on the presidential power of military intervention. Our second advantage was that the affirmative proposal will better secure a truly national policy. Now, I'm sure we would all agree in matters of United States military intervention that a truly national policy would be desirable. Gary and I feel that there are three reasons why the affirmative proposal offers the advantage in attaining that end. The first is that the proposal would necessarily involve both branches in the decision-making process. If the president must obtain senatorial consent before he can send the troops overseas, it also follows that he's more likely to seek and obtain senatorial advice. No longer will policies stem from one man alone, rather they'll represent a consensus between the two branches of government. As such, they're more likely to entail congressional consent. Senator Burke Hickenlooper in the Washington Post, February 27, 1963, tells why. If you have a voice in, or you are consulted about the administration's foreign policy, then you certainly are going to be more likely to support that policy. And Theodore Sorensen, special advisor to John Kennedy, in Saturday Review, April 2, 1966, agrees. He said the kind of national unity that is produced by a careful exposition of all possible courses, and by an effective and informed consensus behind that course, is a considerable asset for any administration beset by war or crisis. The first reason for the comparative advantage, then, is that both branches would be involved in the decision-making process, or more likely to incur congressional consent. Our second line of reasoning is that we're more likely to incur bipartisanship in dealing with issues of foreign policy. Now, Gary and I would argue that American national security policy really ought to represent the view of the government as a whole, or the people as a whole, and not just the view of one particular political party. James Robinson, professor of political science at Ohio State, explains why the affirmative proposal has the comparative advantage. In his book, Congress and Foreign Policy Making, he tells us this: the involvement of a large number of senators in deciding national security policy will likely lead to support of foreign policies. This is especially true for members of the opposition party. Let's have it referred to as the policy of our government, not as the policy of the Democratic or Republican Party. The third component of the comparative advantage lies in the increased likelihood of public support for foreign policy decisions. Now, Gary and I certainly won't argue that if our proposal is institutionalized, all dissension or disagreement with foreign policy decisions is going to come to a screeching halt. We're going to suggest simply that the Senate, acting in conjunction with the President, is better capable of representing the American public than is the President when he acts on his own volition. Thorsten Kalliharvey, senior specialist with the Library of Congress and Foreign Affairs, tells us why. It goes without saying, he said, that a policy lacking the endorsement of the American people cannot long survive. The public acceptability of a policy can most appropriately be determined by the members of Congress. Gary and I have argued today that foreign policy decisions demand our utmost attention. We've examined the present checks that exist. We realize that checks are essential. We think that the affirmative proposal can provide two comparative advantages. Number one, it can provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention. And number two, it can better secure a truly national policy. In time, we'll ask for your concurrence.
John and Gary probably guessed, is going to be the philosophy of this negative team that, by and large, the President operates within the intent of Congress. As Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana told the Senate on January 25, 1955, as executive, the President and the President alone is equipped to make the operating decisions relative to our foreign relations and our armed forces. Conversely, the President cannot declare war. War cannot be declared without inviting the destruction of the nation until it is evident through Congress that the will of the people of this country is fully mobilized. This negative philosophy is going to have three specific ramifications, which I'm going to outline for you. Number one, the President operates within the intent of Congress. What we mean by this is that the decision which the President makes is basically the same decision which the Congress would make if they were given the opportunity to do so. The reason for that is our second ramification, which is that because of effective checks that exist under the status quo, Congress can impose its intent upon a recalcitrant executive. In other words, the President does what Congress wants because if he didn't, they can impose their checks upon him. And this leads us to our third ramification, which is our conclusion. The best check is a preemptive one, and we feel that that applies to the checks today. They are so efficacious that the President has always followed the intent of Congress. Congress has never been forced to use the check. But note what a check is. It's simply a structural form under the status quo, because all that affirmative team is offering you is another check, just another structure. I'm going to suggest that that affirmative case is neither inherent, unique, nor desirable. I'm going to consider those two advantages with that negative philosophy in mind. First, the gentleman told you that the affirmative team is going to provide a more effective check on military interventions. Two initial comments. First, remember, a check is simply a structure. That's all the affirmative plan is, and I'm going to discuss the structural checks under the status quo. Second, I want you to note the use of the words more effective because I don't think the gentleman can provide us with a more effective check. I'm going to demonstrate to you how the present checks can control the President totally. I don't think you can have a more effective check than a total check, and that's what we have today. With that in mind, I want to move on to the substructure of this first advantage and consider the points individually. First, John told you that a check on military intervention is desirable. I'm going to agree with him, but I'm going to go a step further and demonstrate that Congress has control over troop deployment today. For substantiation, I'll turn to Joseph E. Callenbach, professor of political science at Michigan, the American Chief Executive, 1966. The power to raise and support military forces read in conjunction with the necessary and proper clause provide a plausible basis for the contention that, and get this, Congress may determine the uses to which such armed forces may be put, as well as the places where they may be stationed. That's not force levels. I'll read it again for you. Congress may determine the uses to which such armed forces may be put, as well as the places where they may be stationed. That sounds to me like congressional control over troop deployment. So what do we have? We have on one hand a president with power as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. On the other hand, we have Congress with a necessary and proper clause. In other words, we have a check in each branch, the president and the Congress. We feel we have checks and balances in the field of military intervention today, and that's all the gentlemen are talking about. But let's look at the situation a little closer and look at their second point, that the checks today are not efficacious. They talked about two, resolutions and appropriations. I'm going to concede the resolution argument. They're right. Resolutions are not an effective check. But I'm going to question their argument about appropriations. I'm going to make several points. First, appropriations, generally speaking, provides a policy check, and I'll explore this a little deeper. First, let me substantiate it. Burton M. Sapin, Associate Professor of Political Science at Minnesota, in the Making of United States Foreign Policy, 1966. The Appropriations Committees regularly and openly make substantive policy judgments, and their right to do so is not generally questioned. Presumably, these judgments are translated into budgetary decisions. What we're telling you then is that the appropriations check is a policy check. The only question is, can it be used against the president? The gentleman gave us three reasons why it can't. First, they suggested that it's an ex post facto check. In other words, it occurs after the fact. I'm going to disagree with them. Appropriations can be used before the fact. For substantiation, I'll turn to Arthur Selwyn Miller, professor of law at George Washington University Law School, University of North Carolina Law Review, April 1965. Congress not only has the constitutional authority to appropriate money, but indubitably has the power to attach conditions to its appropriations acts through which expenditures may be limited. What I'm talking about then is the appropriations rider. All that the Congress has to do is tack a rider onto the bottom of the annual appropriations bill, which would say, none of these funds shall be used to deploy troops overseas unless Congress approves such deployment. Am I buying the affirmative philosophy? I don't think I'm doing that. What I'm telling you, though, is that if you want that advantage, we can have it today by simply using the appropriation rider before the fact. I'll suggest that the appropriations check is not an ex post facto check. By using the rider, we can have a before the fact check in the form of appropriations. Let's move on. The second thing the gentleman told you was that Congress is reluctant to use the appropriations check because of political suicide. Two comments. Number one, that assumes that appropriations is an after-the-fact check. Political suicide doesn't apply to a before-the-fact check. Second observation, is that I'm going to suggest that political suicide is actually an advantageous point. What John is really telling you is that, for example, we have a crisis in Vietnam, and Congress might want to cut off the funds, except if they do, they're not going to get reelected. That sounds good to me. It sounds like the electorate wants the funds to be continued to be supplied to Vietnam, and Congress is simply responding to its electorate. I think that's desirable. Political suicide doesn't sound like a reason to reject the appropriations check to me, and remember, it only applies to an after-the-fact check. Appropriations can be used before the fact. The third argument the gentleman raised was the idea of reluctance to risk diplomatic defeat. Two observations again. Number one, it only applies to an after-the-fact check. By controlling troop deployments before the fact, there's no chance that we could risk diplomatic defeat. Remember the rider. But second, I'm going to suggest the whole concept of diplomatic defeat really depends upon the way you look at it. If you approve the policy, you might think that abandoning it would mean diplomatic defeat, but then again, if Congress approves the policy, they're not going to check the president. If they don't approve the policy, they're not going to look upon it as diplomatic defeat, but rather a revision of the United States policy towards a more favorable type of stance. I'm going to suggest then that diplomatic defeat does not apply. Second, it only applies once again to an after-the-fact check. I've talked about the rider before the fact. I don't think either political suicide or diplomatic defeat is relevant because the ex post facto argument is not true. The riders are before-the-fact check. But in addition, while we're talking about present checks, I'm going to introduce one the gentleman didn't talk about, substantive legislation, because I believe that that provides an efficacious check before the fact. As Don K. Price, Dean of the Graduate School of Public Administration at Harvard, wrote in the National Security Council 1965, by the process of its legislative procedures, the Congress could reduce the presidency to little more than a symbolic office. What I'm suggesting then is that all Congress has to do to restrain the president is pass a law. For example, if we don't want troops in Vietnam, we pass a law making it illegal for American troops to be deployed in Vietnam, and the president is directly controlled by Congress. I'll suggest once again, substantive legislation is a check upon the presidency. So in re-examining the area of checks and balances, we concluded first, a check on military intervention is desirable, but Congress has a constitutional basis for such control. Second, we examined present checks for the use of the rider before the fact, the use of substantive legislation. I'm going to conclude that the affirmative team does not provide us with a more effective check on military intervention. We have perfectly efficacious checks under the status quo. With that in mind, I want to move on to that second comparative advantage, when the gentleman told us that we're going to better secure a truly national policy. I'm going to categorically disagree with them, making one preliminary observation, which is simply this: the president is the most representative organ in the United States government. I'm going to turn to Grant McConnell, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, the modern presidency. Often we like to assume that since all localities of the nation are represented in Congress, all values cherished by the American people are likewise fully represented, and that in aggregate Congress represents the nation as well as the president does. This assumption, however, is not justified. Mr. McConnell goes on to add, many values and interests are underrepresented or not represented at all in Congress, the interests of the poor and the weak, non-material and aesthetic values especially. What I'm suggesting then is that the president is most responsive as far as the desires of the people of the United States are concerned. If we want a truly national policy, it ought to be left in the hands of the executive, controlled by the presidency. Adding Congress to the consultation is just going to make the policy less representative because, as Mr. McConnell pointed out, Congress does not represent the people of the United States as well. With that in mind, let's move down to the substructure, consider the three specific points of advantage the gentleman claimed. First, they told you they're going to enhance the system with a consensus between the two branches. Note that this is dependent upon their checks and balance argument. If we can maintain that Congress can check the president, I'll suggest that by using the appropriations rider, once again, they can force the president to come before Congress before troops are deployed. We can have consensus between the branches today. I'll suggest that advantage is not unique. It's dependent upon the checks and balances. Let's move on to their second point. They said that they're going to encourage bipartisanship. I'm going to stop now. You like this. I'm going to concede this point to the affirmative team. I think it's the first thing I've conceded. Yes, they're going to encourage bipartisanship. You might want to know why I've conceded it. It's because there are two disadvantages to bipartisanship that I'm going to present now. The first one is that they're going to endanger constructive criticism of policies. According to Malcolm E. Jewell, professor of government, Kentucky, Senatorial Politics and Foreign Policy, 1962, in an age of permanent international crisis, the danger is simply that we may drift to disaster through a chain of uneasy compromises and misguided policies that are protected from effective criticism by the umbrella of bipartisan consultation. What I'm saying is this: when the leadership of both parties, Democratic and Republican, support the same foreign policy, it's very hard for a freshman senator to indicate his criticism. He's risking the wrath of the leadership of his party. In other words, constructive criticism in the Congress is endangered by bipartisanship. Second disadvantage, you're going to destroy the elective check. The point is made by Malcolm Jewell, and it's very simply this: that when the Democratic Party and the Republican Party support the same foreign policy, when the election comes up, which party do you throw out of office? They're both responsible for the same foreign policy. The electoral check becomes unresponsive. You don't know which party to hold responsible. I'll suggest the gentleman will have bipartisanship, and it's going to hang their case. It's definitely disadvantageous. Finally, let me move to the third area of public support. I'm going to call it insignificant. The public is totally uninformed. I'm going to turn to a Gallup poll, November 7th, 1965. The Gallup poll revealed 81% of the people interviewed did not know how their representative voted on any of the major bills passed in 1965. 86% did not know of anything their representative had done for his congressional district. 57% didn't know the name of their congressman. I'll suggest public support is rather insignificant. The public doesn't really know what's going on in Congress. That advantage is insignificant. Bipartisanship is not desirable. Consensus between the branches is not unique. The gentlemen don't have unique, desirable, or significant advantages. I'm going to eventually ask you to reject their case.
In just a moment, I'm going to return to the two comparative advantages which John outlined. Before I do that, let me respond to Alex's 2 points of overview. First of all, he said the President operates with the intent of Congress. Well, my first reaction is there's absolutely no reason then to be against the proposal. Second point is we're going to institutionalize that system where the President's going to act within the intent of Congress because we're going to compel him to have to go before Congress to get approval to send troops overseas. Alex already said then that while Congress would probably agree with the President of the United States, we just want to make darn sure that's the case and have the President always go before them and get their approval. Point number 3, let me propose a contrary example. Senator Wayne Moore's congressional record, May 16, 1966. If President Kennedy had asked the Foreign Relations Committee for its advice before the Bay of Pigs, the overwhelming majority of the Foreign Relations Committee would have advised against it, as the chairman of the committee did when he surprised him at the 11th hour. Now, John and I aren't going to assert that if the President had gone to the entire Congress, they would have said, no, don't do it. What we are going to say is, the President consulted Mr. Fulbright. He said, no, I'm against it. Mr. Fulbright also said, if you consult the entire Senate Foreign Relations Committee, they'll advise you not to do it anyway. Mr. Kennedy knew that, he was told that, but he went right ahead and pursued his policy in the Bay of Pigs anyway. One instance then where he consulted one member of Congress, he was told he didn't approve, the rest of the Foreign Relations Committee wouldn't approve either, and probably Congress wouldn't either. The President of the United States went right ahead and did it. I submit then that he's not bound to accept the opinion of Congress, and John and I suggest that he ought to be. Then Alec had one more point. He said the best check is one that isn't used, which is a nice rhetorical comment because there's absolutely no way we can validify that type of argument. But we'll add just a little bit more, one more clause to that. And that is, the best check is one that isn't used, but one that can be used at all times. It can be used very effectively. John and I are quite sure that our proposal would fit into that qualification. First comparative advantage. The affirmative proposal would provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention. Okay? Alex said, present checks can control the President totally. We don't want to see very many disadvantages to our proposal then for having Congress check the President of the United States, because he says they not only are, but they can do it right now. All right. Number 2, he said from Mr. Callenbach that Congress could determine the force level. But did you catch the piece of evidence that he read? It said something like this. The necessary and proper clause provides a plausible basis for the contention that Congress can determine force levels. John and I agree there is a very plausible base that Congress should in fact control the force levels we have, but that didn't say that Congress does it right now. The evidence said that necessary and proper clause provides a plausible base for it. I submit then that Alex extended that piece of evidence just a little bit. Then we talked about the checks that Congress really have. We talked about congressional resolutions. Alec agreed congressional resolutions don't check the President of the United States. I want to just underline one idea, and that is we said one of the reasons why congressional resolutions aren't any good is that they have no legal effect. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. The second check we said that Congress had nominally was the appropriations check. Alec had several comments to make. He said the appropriations writer means under the appropriations writer you could say that none of these funds should be used for sending troops without congressional concurrence. Well, that sounds to me to be very much like the affirmative proposal. But point number 2, Alec already agreed that a congressional resolution has absolutely no legal effect, no possible way that it can bind the President of the United States. If that's true, they can pass all those appropriations writers if they want to, and the President of the United States is not bound by it. But point number 3, I think you better tell the senators themselves that they have this power, because Senator Mansfield has just introduced a resolution into the United States Senate, which is supposed to give the Senate the power to send troops overseas, or at least indicate that they want that. John and I got back from a tournament from Ohio recently, and the Columbus Weary Citizen, or something like that, says this. Today, Senate Democratic leader Mike Mansfield said that he would push for early action in the new Congress on a resolution demanding congressional approval before U.S. troops are committed to battle abroad. Evidently, Mr. Mansfield doesn't believe that Congress already has the power to do just exactly that. I'm going to submit then, it's certainly not very definite that Congress has as much power as both Alec, John, and I would like to have. Number 2, Alec says that it sounds of political suicide, that the idea that political suicide exists, sounds like the electorate doesn't want the Senate to check the President after all, and so therefore it's a good idea that political suicide is a result of the Senate checking the United States. I think Alec is a little bit misinformed. The reason why political suicide exists is not because the public disapproves of the Senate's action. The public disapproves of not giving enough money to support the boys after they're already overseas, not giving them guns or the food so they can support themselves after they're already over there. Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, if the boys are already overseas, then Congress has absolutely no choice but to approve appropriations to purchase the materials to defend themselves. That's the salient point. That's why political suicide enters into the picture. That's why after the fact check of appropriations isn't very effective. And number two, Alex had talked about diplomatic defeat. He said people won't look at it as diplomatic defeat if the Senate reverses a bad policy. I think Alec again is incorrect. From the Harvard Law Review, June 1968. Sudden about faces and tactics is felt to discourage the confidence of our allies and encourage the actions of our enemies. The result is to make presidential action in the modern context largely irreversible. But point number two, and that's simply this. Why haven't after the fact check? Why not put the check before we send the troops overseas so we have no chance of risking political suicide, no chance of risking diplomatic defeat? Always put the check before we send the troops overseas. Always have the President of the United States go to Congress before he sends the troops overseas and say, do you approve or disapprove? All right, Alex said one more thing. He said Congress can pass substantive legislation as a check, and this law would just say that the President, for example, can't send troops to Vietnam under any circumstances. Now, John and I don't think that's a very good check either. It seems to me if the Congress passed a law saying you can't send troops to Vietnam, that'd be an open invitation for any potential aggressor to aggress in that country, because they knew that they could aggress with complete immunity from any United States action. I submit that isn't nearly as effective check as John and I are advocating either. We don't want those forms of checks. We're talking about a comparative advantage then. What's the comparison? The check that they're offering, the Senate doesn't even believe they have the power that Alec thinks they do. The substantive legislation check, which is an open invitation to aggression, are the one John and I want, and that is to put the check before the President sends the troops overseas. John and I submit that we get the first comparative advantage, that the affirmative proposal would provide a more effective check on the President's power of military intervention. Point number two, we said the affirmative proposal would better secure a truly national foreign policy. First of all, it's very, very interesting to note that Alec didn't object to this as a criterion. He didn't object to this as an advantage. He agreed that if we had national unity in support of our foreign policy decisions, it'd be a very, very good idea. He did object to the idea of bipartisanship, didn't object to the entire advantage. Okay, what did Alec say? He said, the President is the most representative organ for the United States, and we think that's a nice statement, but it's totally irrelevant. Here's why. The comparison is not who's most representative of the United States, the President acting alone or the Senate acting alone. The comparison should be the President acting alone by himself with no check, or the President acting alone or acting with the conjunction, advice, and consent of the Senate of the United States. And John and I are going to submit that whenever the President of the United States acting with advice and consent of 100 other elected officials of the United States or representatives of the United States public, we think that's always going to be more representative than the President acting by himself of his own volition. That's the real issue. Point number two, Alex said, the appropriations writer can force the President of the United States to consult with the Senate all the time, and therefore we'd have the same degree of national unity. One very salient point, I think, is Congress has never passed that appropriations writer. I think Alec is admitting we don't get that consultation right now. As a result, we don't get that national unity right now because Congress hasn't used that appropriations writer. We think we've got an advantage. Let's document it. Congressman Paul Findley of Illinois, lack of compliance with constitutional steps has had the effect of denying to our nation a powerful unifying force. Nicholas Katzenbach, the President acts most effectively when he acts with the support and authority of Congress. Always under our proposal, the President always will go to Congress and get their approval to send troops overseas. That provides for national unity all the time, not just some of the times as Alec is trying to defend. I submit we've got the advantage. Number two, we said we'd be more likely to gain bipartisan support. Alex said he'd hang us on the advantage. I don't think he will. He said when everyone supports the policy, you don't get constructive criticism. You don't get constructive criticism after the policy isn't taken into effect probably very much, but where do we get the constructive criticism? When it's really more valuable, and that is before we already decide the policy, we get it in the formulation process. Before the President announces or dictates the foreign policy, he goes to the Senate for their advice and consent and constructive criticism, gets it, and modifies or changes American foreign policy result. If Alec wants constructive criticism, let's force the President of the United States to go to Congress, get that constructive criticism, and use it under all circumstances to change foreign policy as a result of it. I don't think we're going to discourage constructive criticism. I think we're going to implement it. I think we're going to institutionalize it, make it an integral part of the affirmative proposal. The way we conduct foreign policy right now, I think we've got an advantage. Then Alex said, number two, there'll be absolutely no election check if all the senators and the President of the United States agree about foreign policy. Now what I want to do is come back here and do this. Tell me examples where if the President of the United States supports a policy, has unanimous support of the entire Senate, how many people are going to want to vote him out of office? How many people are going to be against it? I submit not many people will for the third reason of the comparative advantage, and that is we'll be more likely to gain the public support because both branches have concurred in the policy. First of all, I said it's insignificant. I don't think so. Vines and Gordon, two professors of political science at Tulane. Public interest in foreign policy has grown to a point never before reached in ostensible peacetime, and popular support is absolutely essential if these programs are to operate successfully. Number two, the gentleman said the public is uninformed, which doesn't matter. We want the public to be informed or go along with the policy as a result of legislative and executive concurrence. Let's document the advantage. Hubert Humphrey, the UN, the Marshall Plan, and NATO gained the overwhelming acceptance of the American people, in part because of the close partnership between the executive and legislative branches. Ernest Griffith, Director of the Legislative Reference Service, the Library of Congress. When Congress endorses a foreign policy decision, along with that endorsement goes a sense of the support of the United people. We think we're going to be more likely to gain public support and get national unity too. Two comparative advantages then. Number one, a more effective check on the President's power to intervene, one that always occurs. Number two, a greater likelihood of achieving national unity. We opt in for the adoption of the resolution.
Started off by saying he was going to institutionalize intent. I don't know how you can any more institutionalize checks which are already there if they already are there. It's just a matter of whether or not Congress wants to use these checks. I suggest since we have them, they can't any more institutionalize them. But let's see if that affirmative proposal is really going to be able to meet its advantages. Then I'm going to discuss some workability problems, and then I'm going to discuss three specific disadvantages. Now, are the gentlemen really going to have a more effective check on the fait accompli, or as what they call military commitments around the world, military intervention? I'm going to suggest the first reason they aren't going to is because if you look at their particular committee, which is going to be able to act during times of emergencies, 3 of those men are of the majority party. Now, we know we have an exception right now where we have a minority president, but that is the exception. As a rule, we have in the Congress of the United States the majority party, the same one as the president's, that being that these men who follow party lines, all they have to do is follow party lines. 3 men follow the president's party, 3 men dictate a fait accompli. I'll suggest the gentlemen really haven't got a very strong and structural check on the president of the United States if these men follow party lines, which I suggest they will. In essence, that's the first reason why I don't think they have a very strong advantage here. They can't guarantee a structural check when 3 of the men that can initiate a fait accompli in a military intervention are the president's same party. But there's a second reason why they can't meet their advantages, and that is that under their affirmative proposal, they're still dependent upon the President of the United States for information. I'm going to turn for evidence to this fact to Dexter Perkins, chairman of the Department of History at the University of Rochester, writing in 1962. The diplomatic correspondence of the representatives of the United States all over the world is at the President's disposal, whereas the members of the House and Senate must depend oftentimes upon what he chooses to communicate to them. All right, I've established that they're dependent upon the President for the information. What is the effect of this dependence? I'll turn to Charles O. Lurch, professor of international relations at American University. The gentleman used this against me this morning. If Congress must depend on the executive for all its information, there is a real danger that the data fed will be, in the delicate bureaucratic word, selective. That is, deliberately chosen and slanted so as to influence Congress in the direction the bureaucracy desires. I suggest since information means power, the president controls information. They haven't got a guarantee that they're going to meet their advantages. I'll suggest the second reason: the president still is the source of that information. But there's a third reason why they're not going to be able to meet their advantage. This has to do with what they call a securing of a truly national policy. I have one basic comment to make. Alex already indicated we have a national policy now. The gentlemen are telling you that they can get a double national policy. It sounds redundant to me. You get national policy once, you can't get it twice, you can't get it 3 times, you get it once, that's enough. All right, let's see why they're going to have a less responsible foreign policy through this particular committee, why they're not going to have this supposed advantage. The first reason has to do with lobbies. Funny thing, I haven't got my card, I'll quote it by heart. I'll turn to Alfred de Grazia, Chairman. Here it is. Alfred de Grazia, professor of social theory and government at New York University, Republican crisis 1965. Congress is more congenial to the lobbyist, that is the spokesman for a pressure group of an interest, than are the agencies of the executive establishment. I'll first suggest this is the first reason why we're not going to have that national consensus which they're talking about. But there's a second reason why they're not going to be able to guarantee that advantage. It comes from Andrew H. Birding in The Making of Foreign Policy 1966. The second difficulty faced by Congress in foreign affairs is that no individual senator or representative is elected by the people as a whole, as is the president, and therefore no one of them can rightly speak for all of the people, although some may presume to do so from time to time. That's the second reason why we're going to have a less responsible foreign policy. But I want to extend my analysis because, you know, the gentlemen really haven't got the Congress, they really haven't got the Senate making our emergency commitments around the world. They have a joint committee or a senatorial committee which is going to be making our committees. The point being, this is even a smaller group, this is even a more limited constituency, and as Rule Bartlett, a professor of diplomatic history at Tufts University, wrote in 1967, no constitutional basis exists for the right of a congressional hierarchy, however distinguished, to represent the Congress. In other words, if the gentlemen are going to talk about having a better cooperation between the 2 branches of government, why didn't they have a plan which says the 2 branches of government, the Congress and the President, are going to make our military interventions around the world? Why do they have a plan where it's not the second branch of government, the legislature, but just 3 men? 3 men of the same party of the President can make the fait accompli. I'll suggest the gentlemen really haven't provided a rationale for adopting the affirmative proposal. For 3 reasons they won't be able to meet their advantages. Those 3 are: first,
The majority party is the same as that of the president as usual. Second, they're dependent on information. Third, a less responsible foreign policy. Let's go on to an area of workability now. This was the card that messed me up with Mr. DeGrazia. It is important. This has to do with the staffs. Remember, they've got this committee, they've got the Congress, and they're dependent on things called staffs. We turn to James D. Cochran, professor of political science at Iowa State University, writing in 1964. The professional staff gathers much of the information with which the committee deals. They advise the committee members and other members of Congress on the meaning of information which they have gathered, on the intent of proposed legislation, on the intent of effects of existing legislation, and on the need for new legislation. They guide the work of the committees. All right, we've indicated that they're dependent upon the staffs for the particular information at hand. Let's indicate the effect of this, if I can ever find the card. The first effect of this, let's see how big these staffs are. Let's see how big these staffs are under the present system. We'll turn to Burton M. Sapin, Coordinator of International Programs in Minnesota, writing in 1966. Under the terms of the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee are each authorized to employ 4 professional staff members and 6 clerks. That's 20 total. I'll suggest they'll have to increase the size of their staffs if they want this committee running foreign policy. All right, what happens when you increase the size of staffs? We turn to Charles R. Deckard, Professor of Political Science at Purdue University in 1967. Increases in staff, whether of the committees or individual members, could easily lead to their bureaucratization and a loss of flexibility and control by their principals. I want to stress this workability problem then. They're dependent upon staffs to run and control their American foreign policy. These staffs themselves are too small now. You increase the size of the staffs, and not only cannot these committeemen control the president, they can't control their own staffs. I'll suggest a significant workability problem. But I promised you 3 disadvantages. These disadvantages are rather significant, I'll suggest. First, I'm going to suggest we're going to lose Congress as a watchdog. We're going to lose Congress as a watchdog in foreign affairs. Let me emphasize first the important role of Congress in foreign affairs today as a watchdog. I'll turn to Mr. Sapin once again. In foreign affairs, Congress probably serves best as discussant, critic, sharp-eyed investigator, and watchdog than as policy initiator and formulator. I want to emphasize the difference then we have in Congress under the present system and under the affirmative proposal. Now it's a watchdog. Now it's a critic. It can, if it wants to, after the fact or before the fact, check the President of the United States. Under the affirmative proposal, Congress is going to continually be responsible for what? Military policy. It's going to have to initiate and formulate policy. It's going to lose its watchdog role. But there's a second reason why it's going to lose its watchdog role, and that's because the Congress of the United States isn't even involved in making foreign policy anymore. It really is the senatorial committee which can determine our emergency powers and emergency fait accomplis. I'll turn to James A. Robinson, Professor of Political Science at Ohio State University, 1967. If you have a joint congressional committee, the total number of senators and representatives closely acquainted with the details of these issues in foreign policy would thus be appreciably reduced. This is a possible outcome that cannot be considered desirable. The point being, right now we have all sorts of committees in Congress which can criticize foreign policy because they have a role to play in foreign policy. Under the affirmative proposal, they're not even involved. In essence, it comes down to this congressional committee, this senatorial committee. In essence, they're limiting Congress's role as a watchdog. The second disadvantage I have in today's debate is that they're going to rigidify crisis decisions. Rigidify crisis decisions. I want to emphasize the importance of this particular problem. Crises vary. Vietnam conflicts are different from Cuban Missile crises, and it's dependent upon the president to have flexible advice and flexible policies regarding each crisis. This is pointed out by Joyce E. Callenbach, Professor of Political Science at Michigan in 1966. The makeup of the group of executive officials and legislative leaders with whom the president may wish to consult should be kept fluid, depending upon the particular crisis at hand. He gave a perfect example in 1962, or Mr. Koenig did, a professor of political science at New York University, who said Kennedy relied for policy advice on a group soon known to be as the ExComm, or Executive Committee of the National Security Council. The ExComm was a kind of improvisation, enabling the president to meet with those staff members in whose judgment he had particular confidence and whose functional specialty in policymaking was strongly relevant to the crisis at hand. I'll suggest then we have a flexible crisis adaptation under the present system. Under the affirmative proposal, any crisis comes up, the president has to come to the same committee, the same men, the same advice. I'll suggest a significant disadvantage. And let's look at that particular advice. Roger Hilton, Professor of International Affairs at Columbia, Senator Richard B. Russell of Georgia, Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Senator J. William Fulbright, Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, urged an immediate invasion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What I'm trying to tell you is that as regards the Congress of the United States, it is dependent on military solutions to run our foreign policy. Now, I talked with Gary before the round, and he challenged me to bring up this evidence again because I do every time we hit their case. He said, are you going to really read that quote? Yes, I really am going to read that quote. It was the conclusion of Senator Richard Russell, Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, who said, God help the American people if Congress starts legislating military policy. The point being that Congress is dependent upon the military for solutions of problems. We rigidify our crisis alternatives. Gary told me he had a great extension on that argument. I want to hear it. The third one is the diffusion of our nuclear deterrent. The diffusion of our nuclear deterrent. I want to make this point. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy said, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." What I'm trying to get at is right now the president controls nuclear weapons, he controls military deployments, he can set up what Thomas C. Schelling says are tripwires, such as the blockade in Cuba, saying, look, if you don't watch your step, I've got this tripwire and we will launch nuclear weapons. That is, we have a coordinated deterrent under the present system. Now the gentlemen can either continue this uncoordinated deterrent, which I suggest they're going to have under their proposal, or they might say, look, this committee is going to coordinate our deterrent, and we're going to have all these committees decide when we're going to have nuclear weapons exchanged. But there's a problem with that. As Morton H. Halpin, a research associate at the Center of International Affairs at Harvard, wrote in 1967, European security, in addition to American security, would be diluted if the President of the United States were forced to share with any person or committee the power to launch nuclear war. I'll suggest a dilemma here of the disjunctive deterrent. Disadvantages, they aren't going to meet their own advantages. Alec will now extend the negative analysis.
Philosophically, we told you that the President follows the intent of Congress, and we talked about three ramifications. The President follows the intent of Congress because if he didn't, the checks could be imposed upon him to force him to follow it, and that led us to conclude that the best check is a preemptive one, and that's what we have. Gary had three responses. First, he said they're going to institutionalize the checks. Remember what I told you, a check is merely a structure. All that affirmative plan is an institution. We have two institutions today called the Appropriations Rider and the Substantive Law. Then Gary talked about the Bay of Pigs and said, look, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee disagreed and the President ignored them. What he didn't tell you is that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee tried to use the Appropriations Rider, or that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee tried to pass a substantive law and still couldn't control the President. I'll agree, if they don't try to use the checks, we don't expect the checks to work. The point is those checks are still effective in that case. Finally, Gary concluded, the best check is one that can be used all the time. I'll suggest that applies to the rider and the law. They can be used whenever Congress so desires. With that in mind, I want to go over those affirmative advantages again. First, Gary told you that the affirmative team is going to provide a more effective check on military intervention. Remember what I told you preliminarily, that Congress has a constitutional basis for controlling troops. Gary said, well, that's just a plausible basis. Congress hasn't taken advantage of it. Now look, the only plausible basis for presidential control of troops is the Constitutional Commander-in-Chief Clause, and as Mr. Callenbach said, there's a constitutional clause called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which justifies congressional control. In other words, there's a justification either way. There's basically a check and balance in the field of military intervention. The fact that Congress hasn't used the check is totally irrelevant, because let's face it, Congress might not use that affirmative plan. I'm going to suggest that all we're discussing now is structure, and structurally Congress has a check. Then we talked about specific checks. The resolution's been dropped. Let's talk about appropriations. First, I demonstrated that it's a policy check and that the appropriation rider can be used before the fact. Note Gary's responses. First, he accused me of adopting the affirmative plan. Remember what I told you. It's not the affirmative plan. It's a mechanism of the status quo. It merely demonstrates that that affirmative plan is not inherent, and that's the point I was trying to make. Second, he says, the rider has no effect because resolutions aren't binding. I don't know what in the world he's talking about. An appropriations rider is not a resolution. It's a law, just like the appropriations bill is a law. And if the president doesn't obey the law, we'll impeach him. Just like if the president doesn't obey that affirmative plan, all they can do is impeach him. I'll suggest that there's no real difference between the appropriations rider and the affirmative plan, except we have the appropriations rider today, and there's no inherent reason to change. Finally, Gary said the senators don't know about it. I guess I'll have to mail them my evidence so they can wake up and find out. I don't think that's any indictment of the thing. But remember, the rider is a before-the-fact check, and that's all that Gary and John are calling for, a before-the-fact check. We have it today. There's no inherent reason to change. I can't emphasize that too much. Then we talked about political suicide. Remember my first observation, it only applies to an after-the-fact check. The rider applies before the fact. And I said, after all, it shows responsibility to the electorate. What did Gary do? He quoted Senator Ervin, who said that he wants to supply money and he sees no alternative. I'm happy that Senator Ervin sees no alternative but to support the wishes of his constituents. I think that's an advantage. But remember, it only applies to an after-the-fact check. We have a before-the-fact check, and Gary was totally unresponsive. As far as diplomatic defeat goes, remember it only applies after the fact. If we have a before-the-fact check, there's no problem with diplomatic defeat because the commitment hasn't been made yet when the rider is applied, and Gary didn't respond. I don't think that there's a unique reason to change. I don't think there's an inherent reason to change. We have the appropriations rider today. As far as substantive legislation goes, Gary said, well, that's an open invitation to our enemies to invade. It doesn't deny that the check structurally exists and can be used if the Senate doesn't want us to be in Vietnam. If they don't want us to be in Vietnam, they can use
Tiger with your lights on in the parking lot.
Pardon me?
You've got a minute and 40 seconds.
Okay, I'll start. I'm ready. Once again, that doesn't deny the fact that the check can be used. I'll summarize that contention right there. I'll move on to the second one about better securing truly national policy. Gary said that my statement that the president best represents the people is irrelevant because all he's doing is adding Congress. Remember what Hyatt told you, when you have national unity, you can only have it once. That's what we have with the president. Number two, why add Congress when Congress is less representative? If we really want this advantage, let's stick with the president. He represents the national interest, certainly not Congress. All Congress should do is check, and that's what we're advocating under the status quo. It's the gentlemen who want to move into a less national policy. I'll suggest disadvantage, not comparative advantage. First, what about consensus between the branches? I demonstrated that with checks we can compel consensus. Gary said, well, you know, the Senate has never passed a rider. Okay, Senator J. William Fulbright told the Subcommittee on the Separation of Powers that for years now they've been passing riders in the field of foreign aid. I'll suggest they extend that to the field of troop deployment, and we can force consultation between the branches. Number two, what about bipartisanship? I liked his answers. First, I said this is going to discourage criticism in Congress, and he said that's only true if it occurs before the fact. My point was simply this. When both party hierarchies support the same policy, the underlings in the party can't really buck the leadership. If they're not supporting the same policy, where's the affirmative advantage of bipartisanship? Either they have an advantage and it's going to be a problem, or they don't have an advantage at all. Second, I told you it kills the electoral check. When both the Republicans and Democrats support the same policy, who do you throw out of office? Gary said, well, if it's a good policy, when will you want to throw him out of office? Okay, if it's a good policy, we won't. What if it's a bad policy? If both agree on the same policy and it's a disaster, I'll want to throw them out of office, and I won't know which party to vote against, and neither will any of the American people. Finally, what about public support? I told you it's insignificant. Certainly the public has an opinion, but it's based upon misinformation. The opinion is totally irrelevant. I'll suggest that public support is insignificant. The president best represents the people. Consensus between the branches is not unique. Bipartisanship is disadvantageous. Public support is insignificant. The first contention is not inherent. Please reject the affirmative case.
Review the gentleman's alleged plan objections, but before I do that, let me make a general point of overview. I think the gentlemen are in the midst of a giant inconsistency. Alec in the first speech tells you that Congress has all the checks they need. If they want to, they can institutionalize the checks that they have at the present time. Then Hyatt gets up and lists you 14 different reasons why Congress is so incompetent that they ought not to participate in foreign policy decisions at all. I suggest that that's being inconsistent. If the gentlemen want to get out of that inconsistency, I think the only way that they can do it is take one of the instances in which they say Congress has succeeded in checking the president and show me that these disadvantages resulted, because if they can't, then they don't stand at all. Let's look at his particular analysis. Number one, he says you can't make the check work because in your committee 3 men are making the decision, 3 men are from the majority party of the president, and they'll always follow the party lines. I asked the gentleman to take a look at what situations exist today. Who are the most powerful men in the Senate in the majority party? I suggest they're not men who are going to bow to presidential opinion. All of these men have a vested interest in that foreign policy that we formulate. I suggest they're going to be hard-pressed to indicate that any man is just going to follow in line because he happens to be a member of the Democratic Republican Party. I don't think it's valid. Number two, he said you're still dependent upon executive information. In the first place, I'm going to indicate that that's not necessarily so. Congress is informed at the present time. First of all, let me turn to Andrew Birding and insist that Congress does have the information. He says the difference today is that Congress can face the State Department as its self-respecting equal, not merely constitutionally, but it's in its command of competence and expertise as well. But secondly, the adoption of the affirmative proposal would force the President to go to Congress and relay that information. Edward Kalaji, professor of political science at the University of Virginia. Congress would be better consulted, better informed if the President would be forced to defend his policies and administration before the co-equal branch of government. Point number three, the gentleman's disadvantage assumes that we have a sneaky president. If that's true, we say he's sneaky, they say he's sneaky, then let's adopt the affirmative proposal and put a check on the sneaky president. Then he tells us this. We have a national policy at the present time. How can you get a national policy twice? Now, just a minute. How can they have a national policy when he gets up here and asserts to you that we don't want a national policy because we don't want bipartisanship, we don't want everybody agreeing with the foreign policy decision? I think he's contradicting his calling. Number two, he wanted to talk about lobbies. Said your problem here is that lobbies have a great influence on Congress. Lobbies probably do have an influence on Congress, but the point is they don't have very many lobbies in the executive branch at the present time, especially in foreign policy decisions, and I want the gentleman to indicate to me that they are there. I don't think so. Then he tells me this. No congressman can stand for the American people. That's not what we're opting for. We're saying the President and Congress stand together for the American people, not one congressman alone. Then he wanted to go back to the committee and said, your committee is going to be acting all the time, therefore it's going to be even less representative. Let's take time out and talk about this committee. In the first place, it only operates in emergency situations. How many emergency situations have we had? According to the Harvard Law Review, June 1968, not very many. None of the recent military actions appear to have involved such genuine urgency as to preclude congressional participation in the decision to employ the military. I suggest that we have time to consult them. Secondly, in times of emergency, Congress can and has acted fast. Turn to Andrew Birding, the director of the Marshall Plan overseas, says there have been many instances in which Congress has had to act rapidly, and they've done so. I suggest there's no disadvantage. Then he went to a workability argument. I thought this was interesting. First of all, he said the staffs gather the information. Secondly, you have small staffs at the present time. Number three, when you increase the size of the staff over 20, then you create a bureaucracy, which directly contradicts his colleague, because he said that the executive is able to make good foreign policy at the present time. I suggest that the executive has a lot more than 20 people on his information staff. But secondly, let me suggest this. Congress is going to be dealing with issues of troop commitments. They won't have to have the information of running daily foreign policy. That's what his disadvantage is predicated upon. Then he told me that we were going to lose congressmen as a watchdog. I'll suggest that they haven't served their function because the burglars are already broken in. Then he said, look, the president should be able to choose which advisors he wants to listen to. Does our plan preclude that? I don't think so, not at all. The president can still go to those advisors. He can still get their advice, but he has to be cleared in an emergency situation before that committee. Then he told me that we were going to rigidify crisis decisions because the president must have flexibility. He can maintain it. His next disadvantage was interesting. He said Congress is dependent upon the military. My first point is this. Here comes the thing he was waiting for Gary. The next statement in that book, the foregoing comments apply to the House rather than the Senate. Number two, look at the situation that exists. They're going to be making military decisions. What kind of information does he want them to get? Economic? I don't see the disadvantage. Then he says we're going to lose our coordinated deterrent because apparently Congress is going to not operate in lines with the president and be able to allow him to use the nuclear deterrent. I don't think any congressman is so crass as to deny the political safety of the United States. Let's return to the affirmative structure. We offered you two comparative advantages. The gentlemen reduced their arguments to two. They tell us, number one, that the appropriations writer is an appropriate check that can be used at all times. First point of analysis is this. If the gentlemen say that the check is good, that it should be used at all times, then how in the world can they argue against our proposal, which makes certain that it's used at all times? Number two, he says this. We can put the writer in and we can check the policy by substantive legislation. Let's put the check where it can be most effective, where it can work all the time. That's the comparative advantage. Adopt the affirmative proposal.
It was interesting. Why not the writer? Why not the writer? Why don't you use the writer all the time? Well, we probably incur those plan disadvantages, that's why. That's the point. It's not an inherent case. If we want to check the president, if we really want to, we can under the present system, and the gentlemen really haven't denied that basic structural problem. What did Alex say? We don't need any more effective checks under the present system because the president acts within congressional intent, because they never demonstrated one instance where the Congress has tried to use substantive legislation and the appropriations writer and failed to check the president. They talked about how, well, there's only a plausible justification for Congress controlling troops. Well, there's only a plausible justification for the commander-in-chief doing the same thing. The gentlemen just haven't extended their analysis regarding Alex's arguments. What did he say about appropriations? Look, through appropriations we can dictate policy in the committees. Secondly, about appropriations, we can determine particular conditions before the fact. What about those people and they're being depended upon and having a problem with diplomacy and foreign affairs? What about the congressman worrying about the election of the people? Are these structural problems? Are they structural reasons why if the Congress really feels it should check the president in a particular situation, they shouldn't check him? They're not structural reasons at all. They're just particular undesirabilities. They're not structural problems. I'll suggest that if we want more effective checks, we just maintain the present system. There's absolutely no reason to adopt the affirmative proposal. What about that second contention about securing a truly national policy? What Alec and I are saying is, look, there's only one nation, one national policy. You get it once, you can't get it twice. The gentlemen haven't extended their analysis. What did Alec tell you about a consensus between two branches of government? Well, first of all, we can compel consensus under the present system. They haven't denied that. But secondly, what did I tell you? They're not even going to meet that advantage. Why? Because they don't guarantee consensus between two branches of government, just between the president and 5 advisors in the Senate. What about encouraging bipartisanship? First of all, as Alec indicated to you, well, you can have bipartisanship, and if you want to change the policy, which the gentlemen have never denied, what happens? They've all agreed on it. Mr. Joe, who wants to vote, doesn't know which one to choose between. They haven't come to grips with that basic issue. And remember, the more they try and moot bipartisanship, the more they're trying to moot their basic advantage of encouraging national security. And what about that final one about public opinion? Alec and I really don't think it's that salient in today's debate. We don't think public opinion and majority rule solely should determine every particular policy. We think that the President of the United States should, and his advisors. Okay, then I suggest that if we want to have their advantages, we can have them under the present system, but let's look to see why we don't want that particular affirmative proposal. The first reason is they can't guarantee their advantages. What did I tell you? First of all, the 3 men in the majority party are generally going to go along with the President of the United States. I indicated that this was a structural flaw, and the gentleman said, well, today it's not a problem. I admit it, today there's an exception, but generally what happens, the party of the President and the party of the Congress and the majority is the same. The gentleman didn't extend. I said they were dependent on information. He had three points of analysis. First, Congress is informed today. That's not necessarily true. We'll turn to Chief Justice Vincent in United States versus Reynolds. There's a thing called executive privilege. The President doesn't have to give Congress any information which he deems in the national security. They haven't got that information today. In essence, I still think they're still going to be dependent on information. They said they're going to force the President to consult. Why should they force the President to consult when they're already dependent on the President in the first place? That's kind of illogical. And then his big statement was, you can't have a sneaky president. Well, I thought the gentleman assumed a sneaky president, because if we didn't have a sneaky president, I suggest we wouldn't have to have a more effective check on the president on military interventions, and we wouldn't have to have a check on more national policy. In essence, then I think that's a significant workability problem. But what about the less responsible foreign policy? I indicated, first of all, that they're going to have a less responsible foreign policy because of lobbies. The gentleman asked me to document a particular problem. I'll turn to Roger Hilsman, a professor of international affairs at Columbia in 1964. In a review of its own accomplishments, the Committee of 1 Million helped to kill proposed Senate hearings on trade with Communist China in 1959, organized a letter-writing campaign in support of Dulles' brinkmanship policy, and helped to nullify a two-China doctrine. The point being that when the Senate committee or when the Congress gets control of a particular area of foreign policy over troop deployments, there's going to be subject to lobbies. I've already indicated the power of those lobbies. Then secondly, he said, look, all of Congress is going to be involved in policy, so it won't matter about any particular senator. What did I say? In times of emergency, it's going to be this particular clique, this particular three-man committee or five-man committee with 3 men of the majority party that's going to determine policy. That's an even more limited constituency. The gentleman did extend his analysis, and then he said, look, national policy is bipartisanship. No, it isn't. We can have national policy now, headed in the President of the United States, with an easy choice. Either you like the President's policies or you don't, and you can reject them. That's not bipartisanship. Under the affirmative proposal, they combine the two. You have bipartisanship, and what happens? You don't have that effective choice which we have under the present system. What about those disadvantages? First, we're going to lose Congress as a watchdog. The gentleman really said, well, now we're going to make it a more effective watchdog. Yeah, that little committee might be more effective. I already indicated that's not the whole Congress. That was the basic issue. We're going to lose Congress as a watchdog. Remember, I said that basic committee is going to be dependent on the President. I talked about rigidifying crisis decisions, and he said, look, the President can still go to other people. Well, yeah, but the final analysis, it's these 5 men that are going to determine the policy. It's irrelevant all the advice he gets before the fact. These men are the final determinants. And what about the diffusion of the nuclear deterrent? The gentleman really didn't understand my point. Either the President would still continue to control troop deployments and coordinate the nuclear deterrent, or he wouldn't, and it would be diffused in that committee, in which case our security would be undermined. The gentleman didn't extend. And what did he say? He said, according to God Help the American People, that was about the House, not the Senate. No, he's talking to Mr. Dexter's article. I'm talking about Senator Russell of the Armed Services Committee. He is in the Senate. He doesn't want the Senate making foreign policy. We don't either. We can call for the rejection.
Disadvantages first and briefly. First of all, I said this committee is going to blindly follow the leadership of the American Party. And it's difficult to conceive of Senator Fulbright, Senator McCarthy, Senator Morris blindly following President Johnson or President-elect Nixon. I simply fail to see the significance of the disadvantage. Number 2, that Congress is dependent on the executive for information. John said, no, Congress is informed, and Hyatt had a winner. He said it's not true today, and the evidence he used to quote or justify that was from quote from Chief Justice Vinson. Now, how in the heck can you argue against John's evidence being outdated when you're quoting from Chief Justice Vinson? I don't see it. Charles Deckert, professor of political science at Purdue. Committees having legitimate need for classified material largely seem to have been able to gain access to it. I think Congress has the information. Number 3, he said Congress is more congenial to lobbyists. First of all, it's inconsistent because Alex throughout the debate argued that the President and Congress always agree. I don't see the disadvantage. But number 2, how did he substantiate it? He quoted some lobby who claimed success in a lot of areas. Now what did you expect? That lobby to say, well, no, we haven't done a darn thing good, or we haven't had any influence at all? Well, of course not. They wouldn't say that. The point is, as John indicated, there aren't very many lobbies dealing with foreign affairs, a lot of them in domestic affairs, but not foreign affairs. I think that's the salient point. Then the gentleman said Congress is going to lose its watchdog role. John said the whole Congress gets to vote on troop commits except in emergencies which don't occur very often. I think the gentleman loses the point. Then he said about Senator Russell. He said Senator Russell was talking about just the Senate too. All the evidence from Mr. Dexter, he read 4 pieces of evidence, that type of thing, and Mr. Dexter's conclusion was that all those objections apply to the House rather than the Senate. It's the Senate that's using our proposal. Then finally, he said we're going to lose our coordinated deterrent. The quotation he read said, if the President lost his ability to use nuclear weapons, and we're not changing that, the President can still use nuclear weapons, I submit then there really aren't disadvantages to the proposal. Let's go back to the rationale for adopting the case. First of all, they told us the President operates within the intent of Congress. I said, well then there's no reason at all to be against the affirmative proposal. Number 2, I used the example of Bay of Pigs, and what did Alex say? Alex said, right, the President went against the Bay of Pigs, but the Senate Foreign Relations Committee didn't try to use the check. Well, first of all, it's directly contradictory, because obviously then the President doesn't always go along with congressional intent, like Alex started out saying. But number 2, I think that proves that even when the Senate disagrees with the President of the United States, they have no recourse, no way to check the President of the United States, even when he goes against their stated intent, or even when he goes against their stated position, the Senate couldn't check him. I submit then that's the rationale for adopting the proposal. All right? Then we talked about what type of checks we have. We both agreed that we ought to have a check that's always before the fact, that Congress always has that check. But you know, we don't even know what the print team is trying to defend. Alex says, oh yes, a before-the-fact check that occurs all the time is very, very good. In fact, we have it right now. Hyatt says, no, we shouldn't have it. I'm not even sure where the negative team stands. But point number 2, the only before-the-fact check that they could offer to us was the appropriations writer. I want to raise 2 points. Number one, they simply can't enforce it. For example, Congress has tried before to try and enforce upon the President that before he sent troops overseas, he had to get congressional concurrence, and the President never went along. From Professor Francis Warmuth at New York University, President Truman ordered the dispatch of American combat forces without seeking approval from Congress. The President acted in this fashion despite the United Nations Participation Act of 1945, which is a law like they want to use. It stipulated that any agreement which the United States supplied troops to the United Nations must be approved by Congress. They passed the law which supposedly was going to bind the President. The President said, tough, he went right ahead. There's no way for the Senate to enforce by law even on the President of the United States their will. Number two, it's interesting enough that no one in the Senate even knows that they have this power because they've introduced the resolution, not the appropriations writer that Alec wants them to use. I submit we've got a check that is always there, one that's always effective, one that's always before the fact. I think we've got the first comparative advantage. Let's turn to the second comparative advantage. And that is we have more chance of a truly national foreign policy. First of all, if we continue to assert we have a national policy now, let's just refer you to President Johnson in Vietnam. All the Gallup polls I read said that a lot of people disagree with President Johnson. In fact, only 27% support him. I submit we don't have a national policy. Then Alex said, well look, we don't have national policy, we can force consultation. First of all, it's inconsistent with his earlier position. Number two, he agreed it's an advantage to get national policy and consultation. And number three, they don't have it now, obviously, in Vietnam. Under our proposal, we could institutionalize it. I submit the first area of advantage. Then number two, we talked about bipartisanship. He said, look, under your proposal, no underlings, all underlings would be forced to go along. A good example of that is Senator Hatfield. As a freshman senator from the state of Oregon, he went against Republican position. He's against the war in Vietnam. I submit they can still dissent. And number two, he said there might be a bad policy, even though 100 senators would agree with the policy and the president would agree with the policy, that still might be a bad policy and the people would have no choice. I asked him to show me an example of it, but he couldn't, especially in light of the third area of advantage. What was the third area of advantage? That is, that if the Senate and the President went along, the public would be more likely to accept it. Vines and Gordon said it was essential. Mr. Griffith said it worked out that way too. Mr. Humphrey said we got a lot of public support for UN and NATO because we had concurrence between the two branches of government. The late Senator Robert Taft. The American people certainly do not believe or intend the President's power should be arbitrary and unrestrained in foreign policy. They expect their senators to be their voice. So do John and I. We want to get legislative and executive concurrence. We think that leads to national unity. We want a more effective check. We opt for the adoption of the resolution there.
In the book Theory and Practice of American Foreign Policy, professors of political science at Tulane University, Vines and Gordon tell us this. The constitutional system of checks and balances was designed to ensure cooperation between the branches of federal government. This cooperative concept of governmental separation of powers is particularly important in foreign relations because all Americans recognize today that foreign policy decisions represent life and death issues. It's because Gary and I believe that the responsibility of certain foreign policy decisions is too great to entrust to a single individual. We propose today that executive control of United States foreign policy should be significantly curtailed. In analyzing the proposition, Gary and I will concern ourselves with current methods of policy formulation and implementation. Because we believe that the affirmative proposal presents us with a situation that is comparatively advantageous to the present approach, we offer the following two-point proposal. Plank number one, no United States troops may be dispatched overseas without the consent of the Senate. No U.S. troops dispatched without Senate consent. Number two, a senatorial committee comprised of 3 elected members of the majority party, 2 elected members of the minority party, shall be empowered to grant emergency power to the President. That's a senatorial committee, 3 members of the majority party, 2 from the minority party, shall be empowered to grant emergency powers to the President. Now, in support of this proposal, we offer the following 2 comparative advantages. Number 1, the affirmative proposal will provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention. The affirmative proposal will provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention. And number 2, the affirmative proposal will better secure a truly national policy. Let's turn our attention to the first area of comparative advantage, that the affirmative proposal would provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention. Now, Gary and I recognize, as I'm sure we all do, that the President's power to direct American forces anywhere in the world really ought to be, and nominally is a power checked by another branch of government. Senator Wayne Morris, before Senate hearings July 20, 1967, points to the necessity for these checks. More in foreign policy and in war than in any other endeavor, more today than ever before, the United States government and its people should adhere to the constitutional principle of separation of powers. We are in a nuclear age. where decisions made in error or in haste by one individual can bring ruin to a nation, misery and hopelessness to its people, and produce mountains of debt. Gary and I will not argue that checks do not exist today. We realize it was the intent of the constitutional framers that the president be checked. We further realize that nominally checks do exist. We will suggest that an examination of the two most widely recognized checks will demonstrate the comparative advantage that rests with the affirmative proposal. Those two checks are congressional resolutions and the power of appropriations. First of all, congressional resolutions. Some insist that these resolutions, which express the opinion of the House or Senate, may be used to thwart an undesirable presidential policy. 2 points need to be raised. The first is that these resolutions cannot compel a change because they lack legal binding effect. The second is that these resolutions can constitute only an ex post facto check. Charles O. Lurch of the Washington Institute of Foreign Affairs underlined each point in his book, Foreign Policy of the American People. He tells us this: a resolution expressing the sense of the House or Senate without legal effect serves notice that the congressional mind has been made up. Such resolutions are most effective when they are passed prior to the making of a firm commitment by the executive. Gary and I are going to suggest when the executive has made the commitment, when the troops are already overseas, that the power of congressional resolutions cannot constitute a check as effective as that of the affirmative proposal. Senator Roman Ruska of Nebraska, before Senate hearings July 19, 1967, told us why. The President has, in many cases, compelled armed forces to military action without congressional approval, leaving absolutely no choice to Congress but to go along with his proclaimed policy. The second check to be examined is that of appropriations. Some insist that the appropriations check is the most effective because if Congress disagrees with a presidential option, they may simply vote to remove the necessary funds. One thing is clear from the outset, however. That is that the check of appropriations is only an ex post facto check. Gary and I feel that there are two factors which preclude appropriations from being the necessarily effective check. The first is the understandable reluctance of congressmen to commit political suicide by voting against a proposal that's already been initiated by the president when the troops have been sent abroad. Congressman Paul Finley of Illinois, before Senate hearings July 21, 1967, explains the situation he finds himself in. The need for the president to go to Congress to finance and supply troops already in the field, he said, is not a sufficient break. Vietnam is an ideal example, because regardless of the wisdom of the basic war policy involved, what senator in his right mind will vote to cut off or limit the supplies that might mean life or death to the man in the field? He concludes such a move would be politically unfeasible. The second factor limiting the effectiveness of the appropriations check is the reluctance of congressmen to risk diplomatic defeat for the United States once the president has made the commitment. Cecil Crabb, professor of political science at Vassar, in his book American Foreign Policy in the Nuclear Age, explains why. Congress can, of course, simply refuse to appropriate funds. Such drastic action seldom occurs because Congress is as aware as the officials in the executive department of the gravity of conditions prevailing in the international community. It has absolutely no desire to risk diplomatic defeat for the United States. We conclude for two reasons, then. The appropriations check cannot constitute a check as effective as that of the affirmative proposal. Cognizant of the need for meaningful checks on the president's power of military intervention, realizing the detailed inspection indicates that the comparative advantage rests with the affirmative proposal, Gary and I asked the pertinent question: why not put the check where it can be most effective, in the policy implementation formulation stage? Called the second comparative advantage was that the affirmative proposal will better secure a truly national policy. Now, Gary and I feel that a truly national policy would be desirable in cases of United States military intervention. We further feel that there are three factors which make the affirmative proposal advantageous in reaching that end. The first is that the proposal necessarily involves both branches in the decision-making process. If the president must get congressional consent before he can send troops overseas, it follows that he's also more likely to look for congressional advice. No longer than man alone. That will represent a consensus between the two branches of government. As such, we're more likely to get congressional consent. Senator Burke Hickenlooper in the Washington Post, February 27, 1963, explains the position. If you have a voice in, or you are consulted about the administration's foreign policy, you are certainly going to be more likely to support that policy. Theodore Sorensen, special advisor to John Kennedy, Saturday Review, April 2, 1966, underlined the point. The kind of national unity that is produced by a careful exposition of all possible courses and by an effective and informed consensus behind that course of action, is a considerable asset for any administration beset by war or crisis. First reason for the comparative advantage, then, both branches would be involved. We're more likely to entail congressional support. Our second line of analysis is found in encouraging bipartisanship in dealing with issues of foreign policy. Now, Gary and I would argue that American national security policy ought to represent the view of the government or the people as a whole, not just the view of one particular political party. James Robinson, professor of political science at Ohio State, in the book Congress and Foreign Policy, explains why the affirmative proposal has the advantage. He said the involvement of a large number of senators in deciding national security policy will likely lead to support of the policy decisions. This is especially true for members of the opposition party. Let's have it referred to as the policy of the United States government, not as the policy of the Democratic or Republican Party. The third component of comparative advantage lies in the increased likelihood of public support for foreign policy decisions. Now, Gary and I certainly won't argue that if our proposal is institutionalized, all dissension with foreign policy decisions is going to come to a screeching halt. We're going to simply suggest that together, the President with the Senate is better capable of representing the American people than is the President when he acts on his own volition. Thorsten Kalliharvey, Senior Specialist on Foreign Affairs with the Library of Congress, in Annals of the American Academy, tells us why. It goes without saying that a policy lacking the endorsement of the American people cannot long survive. The public acceptability of a foreign policy can most appropriately be determined by the members of Congress. Gary and I have argued today that foreign policy decisions need our utmost attention. We have agreed that checks on the presidential power of military intervention are essential. We've examined the checks and found two comparative advantages stemming from the adoption of the affirmative proposal. Number one, we could provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention, one that would always be there, one that could always be effective. Number two, we conclude that the affirmative proposal would better secure a national policy, a truly national policy, in matters of United States military intervention. In time, we'll ask for your concurrence.
I'd like to examine, first of all, the gentleman's introduction, because I think we're going to be hearing a lot more of it in today's debate, the gentleman's general rationale. He tells us that we have to have more control than one man over United States foreign policy. Now, he can justify this in two ways. Number one, he could justify his proposal as being more democratic. We'll get the people involved. Or number two, he's going to have to justify the proposal as a need for the check, and that the Senate of the United States is the necessary body that ought to have that check. And I don't think the gentleman has proven either one of those considerations in today's debate, and I'm going to prove that as I look at what the gentleman had to say. But before I do that, I want to look at the gentleman's plan. I think it was a rather sketchy plan. I think there are a whole series of questions that I think I have to ask about this plan. I don't mean to bore you with a number of questions, but I think it's important for Jim to find out what the gentlemen are going to do. First of all, I'd like to know if the gentlemen are going to do away with the regular rules of procedure of the Senate, whether the Senate shall operate as it presently does. All right, that's the first question. Number two, I want to know if these particular people that are going to be elected by the Senate are going to be, the 3 members of the majority, 2 members of the minority, are going to be elected by party caucus or by the Senate as a whole. Number 3, I want to know how this emergency power will be used. Can these 5 men, even against the will of the Congress, grant the emergency power to the President? I think it's a significant question. I think it's a significant question the gentlemen haven't answered in today's debate. Number 4, I want to know if the gentlemen are going to make any other structural changes as far as the present relationship between the executive and the legislative are controlled in foreign affairs, except for the fact that troop intervention has to be approved by the affirmative plan. I mean the whole broad range of foreign affairs. Are they going to make any other legislation necessary for the implementation of the affirmative plan? I think those are going to be significant issues when Jim gets up. Now let's examine the affirmative case. The first affirmative case is that we're going to have a more effective check on the President. All right. The gentleman agreed that present checks do exist. All right. So now this becomes a comparison. Now, in order for it to be a significant comparison, they're going to have to do 3 things. Number 1, they're going to have to show that a check is vitally needed. Number 2, they're going to have to show that the present check is ineffective. And number 3, they're going to have to show that their check is effective in a significant degree. And I don't think they've proven any one of those things to justify that advantage. Let's examine the advantage and find out why. First of all, they talk about congressional resolutions. I'll agree with the gentleman. The congressional resolution is not binding upon the president. But what was the gentleman's point? The president is more effective when he uses a congressional resolution. I'll say the Congress recognizes that. We had such things as the Gulf of Tonkin resolution before the United States escalated in Vietnam, and we've had a series of other resolutions, such as the Middle East resolution of 1957, which President Eisenhower used as justification for the 1958 intervention. So I'll suggest that resolutions can be used by the president to make the policy more effective as far as the world's concerned. So all we have to worry about now is effective checks within the present system. All right, that leads me to the second line of analysis, the gentleman's power of the purse. You know, when I heard the gentleman's power of the purse coming out, he said he was going to have 2 points. And I was really waiting for him to effectively handle the present power of the purse. Number one, he said it's an ex post facto power. It only goes into effect after the fact. And he suggested this was inefficient for 2 reasons. Number one, a senator's not going to risk his political skin against popular opinion, against supporting a war. Number 2, that we're not going to suffer a diplomatic defeat for the United States. All right, I've got a series of questions here, and I think they're significant points. Are senators interested in public opinion? Is this the thing that would force them not to use the ex post facto check? If it is, the gentlemen are going to have to prove to us that the senators are immune to public opinion, that the president can rally before he even uses troops. Because if Jim can prove, or if I can prove, that the president has effective means of rallying public opinion to make political life absolute Hades for the Senate, I am going to suggest that the particular check they have is no more effective than what they say the present system is. I think it's an inherency point. Number 2, they talk about diplomatic defeat for the United States. And here they say this: the Senate will not suffice to give a diplomatic defeat to the president. Now, I want you to listen to the analysis here. On one hand, if we intervene with troops and the Senate rejects the president, that's diplomatic defeat. But if the president goes before the world and says, I swear to you all that if the North Koreans could cross that 38th parallel, I will intervene. But then, if the Senate contradicts the president, it isn't a diplomatic defeat for the United States. I think that's an awfully fine line. I think it's an awfully fine line of advantage that the gentlemen are going to have to prove significance for. But what's perhaps more important, the gentlemen have completely ignored within the power of the purse one check that is effective in the present system if, in fact, the Congress wants to use this check. I don't say the Congress should use this check. I say if it's an inherency point, if the Congress wants to use this check, it's got one. I turn to Sheldon Appleton, professor of government at Oakland University, United States Foreign Policy, 1968, page 89. In addition to regulating the quantity of funds for foreign policy purposes, Congress may impose restrictions on their uses. All right, this was more commonly referred to as a legislative veto. When you pass an appropriations bill, you say X planes, X ships, X gas cannot be sent to send troops overseas without congressional approval. Remember what Senator Mansfield recently had a resolution before the Senate proposing this very thing on troop limitation for Europe. I'll suggest maybe the Congress has never used this check, but then again, the gentlemen have never proven to us the Congress has ever had to use a check. I'll suggest that it's at the inherency point. If the Congress wants to use a check, it's available to it. I don't think it's a significant advantage. Number 2, they're going to secure a national policy that will be effective, and they give a number of reasons. Now, this is the point. The gentlemen quibble. On one hand, they tell me that it's the Senate, and on the other hand, they say we have to have the popular opinion of the American people represented through their Congress. The gentlemen always say the word Congress, but the affirmative plan always comes out the word Senate. All right, now here's the point. 51 senators can be elected by less than 30% of the population of the United States. The body is not representative of the people. 30% of the population can elect a majority of the United States Senate. So let's establish that right now it's not a democratic institution. It's 2 per state. If you come from New York, it's 2. If you come from Utah, it's 2. If you come from Washington, it's 2. No matter where you come from, it's 2 senators, no matter what the population is. So we're not talking about democracy here. We're only talking about whether the Senate is going to give a more effective check. Then the gentleman suggests perhaps we'll have more careful exposition of factors involved in intervention. I have 2 suggestions. Number 1, you better guarantee me then that this 5-man board won't grant emergency power to the president every time he says there's an emergency in order to have these effective alternatives. And number 2, you better suggest to me that there will be effective alternatives presented in the Congress that were not presented within the executive branch. Robert Kennedy in his book pointed out that 15
15 men were on the console that you handled the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that of these 15 men, there were 5 or 6 major groups that extended from Adlai Stevenson on one hand that wanted to leave everything alone, to Robert McNamara and a few other hawks who wanted to bomb the living blazes out of everyone. There are your alternatives, your scope of alternatives. Now here's the point. Where is the significance of the affirmative proposal? How many more alternatives will be suggested? How much more effective will they be? All right, then they talked about bipartisanship in government. Well, first of all, is bipartisanship good in government? The gentleman says that once we get involved, then everybody will be part of the involvement, and hence they won't criticize. What if everybody makes the wrong decision? What if everybody gets us into the wrong war? No, wait a minute. We've got bipartisanship. There won't be a Wayne Morse, there won't be a Fulbright, there won't be an anything if we believe what the gentlemen say, that we'll have bipartisanship. There'll be no voice of the American people to speak out if we believe the affirmative advantage. And for purposes of this argument, I believe the affirmative advantage, and I think they better prove significant difference. All right, finally, what about the public and the president? Now, I want you to listen to what the gentleman said here. They said the president plus the Senate equals broader representation of the American people. I don't buy that. Right now, the president is elected by all the American people. True, Richard Nixon only got 42%, but that's better than 30%. But here's the point. You get a president kowtowing to 51 members of the Senate, because after all, he's got to get their approval, that represent only 30% of the American people. He goes on his hands and knees to them every time he wants everything. Now, is that more representative than a president that represents all the people, or a president that represents only 30% of the American people? Because these are the senators that count. These are the men that have the effective voice. These are the men that we have to be involved with. That's the question again. Where's the significance of the affirmative advantage? All right, now why is this point important? Let's say that 30% of the American people don't like a particular involvement. All right, they say there's public dissension because a minority is suppressed. I ask you to think of the public dissension if a majority were depressed. You'd have the DAR out in tennis shoes in front of every state capital, every national capital, if the majority were suppressed. I'll suggest again the gentlemen don't have a significant advantage.
I kind of feel like Ed McMahon following the monologue, but nevertheless, I want to talk about what he had to say. First of all, before I talk about the 2 comparative advantages which John introduced, I want to answer the gentleman's 4 questions. First of all, are we going to do away with the procedures of the Senate? John and I don't think it'll be necessary. We think the Senate's very concerned about national security. We think they'll act properly and do a good job. Number 2, how will your committee be chosen? There'll be 3 members of the majority party, 2 members of the minority party in this committee, all elected by and responsible to the entire membership of the Senate. We think we have a very representative committee, a very good one. Number 3, can these men go against the will of Congress? Well, there's certainly no reason to, since they're elected by and responsible to Congress and elected for the sole reason to represent them. They're probably not very likely to go against the wishes of Congress. Number 4, is any other legislation necessary? We don't think so. We think our affirmative proposal combined with constitutional amendment or whatever legislation necessary would do the job. Let's turn to those 2 comparative advantages. Number 1, the affirmative proposal would provide a more effective check on the presidential power of military intervention. It's kind of interesting to note that the gentleman said, oh yes, if Congress really wants to use that check, they can, which it seems to me is going to be quite inconsistent when his colleague gets up here and starts talking about disadvantages, but we'll be interested in finding out how he gets around that too. First of all, we talked about congressional resolutions. We said there are 2 problems. Number 1, they have absolutely no legal effect at all, and number 2, they're ex post facto. The gentleman agreed. He said the president isn't bound by the check of congressional resolutions. They have no legal effect. 2 points I want to make. That seems to me that just he kind of hampered his effectiveness of that appropriations check, and he talked about it a little bit later. But number 2, I think, was an admission of the 3rd part of the 2nd comparative advantage, and that is when Congress endorses the presidential policy by congressional resolution, there's more public support. So I think he was inconsistent a little bit later on when he started talking about the 2nd comparative advantage. Let's go down to the check of appropriation. We said there are 2 reasons which made the appropriations check never used, but not as effectively used as the check John and I offered. Those 2 reasons were political suicide and secondly diplomatic defeat. What does the gentleman say? Was the Senate so concerned with public opinion that they won't act whenever they think the public is against them? No, that's not true. What we said is the senators of the United States don't feel they can use the appropriations check because it would have the effect of denying guns and the food necessary for the boys to defend themselves, and that's what the public would be very unhappy about. That's the issue. Now, we didn't say that meant that the Senate would never at any time use the appropriations check. What we did say is, That's the kind of check that we think is inferior, or not as good as, or not as comparatively advantageous as, the check John and I are offering, which occurs before the fact, before the troops are sent overseas, before the Senate can be indicted because they didn't support the man after they already got overseas. That's why we want the affirmative proposal. We have a comparatively more advantageous check, a more effective check, one that occurs before the fact. Then the second thing the gentleman said was, look, the President can still announce under your program that we'll intervene against anyone who attacks Korea, and you'll incur the disadvantage of diplomatic defeat. Well, if he had the power, that might be very credible. He could announce that. But now, under our proposal, if the President announced we'd attack anybody who intervened against Korea, that'd be like Senator Wayne Moore standing up and saying we won't do it. Senator Wayne Moore doesn't have the power to speak for the country. He can't commit us diplomatically. Under our proposal, the President of the United States can announce to the whole world that we're going to defend any country, no matter, just on his own volition. That's the whole point or impact of the first case. The President doesn't have that power anymore. We don't think he should. We think he should have to get the advice and consent of the Senate of the United States. All right. Then he talked about the appropriations writer. He said Senator Mansfield introduced a resolution that said the Senate ought to have the check on the President of the United States. 2 points. Number one, if Senator Mansfield's resolution is ever accepted, that's the affirmative proposal. We want the President of the United States to always have to go before Congress and get their consent to send troops overseas. So I think they're advocating for the affirmative proposal. But point number two, recall the effect of a congressional resolution. Even the gentleman admitted that congressional resolution, as what Mansfield's offering, has absolutely no legal effect. It doesn't bind the President at all. The President can choose to ignore it at his whim or at his discretion. That's why the check that they want to offer, that appropriations writer congressional resolution, isn't as effective as what John and I are offering. We're offering a check that compels the President of the United States to always go before Congress, before the fact, and in all cases, he has to accept their advice. The thing they're offering then is one that the President can choose to ignore or choose to accept, but at his discretion. We think the President is a better check to have the President be forced to go to Congress, be forced to accept their advice and consent. Let's turn to the second comparative advantage. The affirmative proposal would better secure a truly national foreign policy. First of all, the gentleman didn't quarrel with the idea that a national foreign policy is desirable. It's really good to have a national foreign policy, not just the foreign policy of one man. What did the gentleman say first of all? He said 51 senators can get elected by 30% of the popular vote. Well, of course, Mr. Nixon got elected by 42% of the vote, not very significant difference. But point number two, and I think the most important one, is it really not relevant. What we're discussing is not who's most representative of the people, the Senate or the President of the United States. We're discussing who's most representative of the people. The President acting by himself with no effective check, or the President acting in conjunction with 100 other elected officials of the United States people, the President plus the Senate. So that's the comparison I want to have them make. Not the President as against the Senate, the President alone, or the President with the Senate of the United States, 100 other elected people elected by and responsible to the people. John and I suggest the comparative advantage lies with the affirmative team, that we've got a more representative form, we've got more chances of getting national unity. Then the gentleman said the executive branch discusses all of the alternatives, and the example he gave was Cuba. First of all, I'm going to suggest that the executive branch discussing all of the alternatives doesn't provide a viable check on presidential decision-making. He can still commit troops and go against his presidential advisors. Rule Bartlett, professor of diplomatic history at Tufts, Senate hearings July 19, 1967. Some people contend that checks and balances are now provided by diversities of opinion within the executive branch. This is an argument scarcely worthy of small boys. Now, I didn't want to put that in because I know the gentlemen are all both older than I am, but that's what the quotation says. If the President is restrained only by those whom he appoints, and hold their positions at his pleasure, there is no check at all. So I submit if they're going to entertain that as a viable check on the President's actions, it isn't a very good idea. But number two, the used example to prove this, the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was very, very atypical. Robert F. Kennedy, McCall's Magazine, November 1968. Everyone talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, everyone had an equal opportunity to express themselves and to be heard directly. It was a tremendously advantageous situation that does not frequently occur within the executive branch of the government where rank is so important. The point is, those discussion of alternatives, number one, doesn't provide a check. Number two, doesn't occur very, very often at all. In fact, it occurs so infrequently that when it did happen, Mr. Kennedy was able to comment about it and say how great it was. Now, the idea, though, is under their proposal, alternatives are proposed and discussed at presidential discretion. Alternatives are accepted at presidential discretion. They said it's a good idea to have all these alternatives. John and I are going to institutionalize those alternatives under our proposal. The President has to go to the Senate. He has to get those alternatives. He has to act on those alternatives. We think we have a comparative advantage. They said it's a good idea to have the alternatives. We're going to force the President of the United States to go to the Senate to get those alternatives. We think we've got the comparative advantage. We think we're going to get national unity as a result of it. Remember, they didn't really quarrel with the advantage of national unity. Congressman Paul Findley, Senate hearings, August 23, 1967. Lack of compliance with constitutional steps has had the effect of denying to our nation a powerful unifying force. Nicholas Katzenbach concurs, The President acts most effectively when he acts with the support and authority of Congress. I submit then the advantage of national unity. But number two, we said we'd be more likely to gain bipartisan support, and the gentleman came up with a winner. He said there'd be no voice to speak out if we had a bad policy. Well, first of all, John indicated very clearly, I thought in his speech, that just because we had a consultation in the executive and legislative branch, it didn't mean there'd be absolutely no dissent at all. We don't expect 100-0 votes. We don't usually get that. But number two, let's take his example. You know, it's not very likely at all that all the people would be against a foreign policy decision. If 100 senators agreed with it and the president agreed with it, there wouldn't be too much likelihood that the people would want to vote these men out of office. They'd probably accept it too. That's why we had the third point on our advantage. But number three, the gentleman said we ought to use dissent. John and I think so too. Why wait and use the dissent after we already send the troops overseas? Why not have the President of the United States go to Congress, get their dissent, get their constructive criticism, make some use of it, and use that as a check on the President's action so we get the best alternative or best foreign policy decision made? If they want to have senators have a voice and to be able to constructively use their dissent, have the President of the United States go to Congress before he commits the troops overseas, take their advice, take their consent, utilize their dissent, and I think we've got a comparative advantage again. Number three, we said we'd be more likely to gain public support. The gentleman repeated his issue that the President is more representative than the Senate, which isn't the issue. The issue is who's most representative, the President alone or the President plus the Senate. We think the comparative advantage lies with the affirmative team. And then also he says possibly you'll have dissent even after your proposal is adopted. Agreed, possibly that's true. We don't think it's very likely. The comparative advantage reads we'd be more likely to gain public support. Let's explain why. Hubert Humphrey, the UN, the Marshall Plan, and NATO gained the overwhelming acceptance of the American people in part because of the close partnership between the executive and legislative branches. Ernest Griffith, Director of the Legislative Reference Service of the Library of Congress. When Congress endorses a foreign policy decision, along with that endorsement goes a sense of the support of the United People. The late Senator Robert Taft, his book Foreign Policy for Americans, the American people do not believe or intend that the President's power should be arbitrary and unrestrained. They want a voice in the more important features of that policy, particularly those relating to peace and war. They expect their senators to be their voice. John and I concur with Mr. Taft, we concur with Mr. Griffith, we concur with Mr. Humphrey. We expect the senators to be the voice of the people. We expect the senators to provide for advice and consent for presidential policies, to intervene in other countries. We want to have the advantages, number one, of having a more effective check on the President's power to intervene militarily, not just some of the time, not just at presidential discretion, but all the time when he has to take their advice and consent. And secondly, we want to gain the advantage of national unity. We can get that because we'll require legislative and executive consultation. National unity and public support will stem from that. We opt then for the adoption of the affirmative resolution.
Gentlemen, I normally start my constructive speech with an overview of the way the debate's been going, since after all I am the last constructive speaker. All I'm going to say at this point, though, is that the affirmative team said yes. They said yes twice. Yes, they're keeping the President's Senate rules. Yes, they're going to let the representatives be elected by the entire Senate. I think you'll see that they ought to regret that as I look at some plan disadvantages. First, though, let's look at some issues of solvency, some reasons that their plan cannot attain the goals that they want it to attain. I'm going to have three of them. Number one, the President controls public opinion. Let me read the evidence and I'll explain the argument. I quote Nelson W. Polsby of Wesleyan University, Congress and the Presidency, 1965. Invariably, the popular response to a president during an international crisis is favorable, regardless of the wisdom of the policies he pursues. Okay, here's the point. It is a fact of political life that it is to the president to whom the people look for leadership. He's the one that can mold their opinion. No matter what organically or structurally that affirmative team does, they cannot place any more effective a check on the president because of the simple fact that he's the one that controls public opinion. They can't change that with a change in structure. Second solvency issue. That executive information is the same information as congressional information. Let me explain what I mean when I say that executive and congressional information is the same. They're going to be having Congress make decisions. Well, I'm going to say decisions are based upon information. Information comes from experts. So no matter if the President takes the information and makes decisions, or if Congress takes the information and makes decisions, the decisions themselves are going to be essentially the same, therefore no different decisions, therefore no better check under the affirmative proposal. Let's get an example by quoting Edward A. Colliget, head of the Department of Government at the University of Virginia, 1966. The test band hearings provide but one dramatic example of Congress' dependence on the expertise of the executive branch, now a routine, largely unnoticed feature of its annual defense appropriations and authorization hearings. Third solvency issue, the executive controls information. I've emphasized the reliance of Congress on executive information. Let's indicate now how the executive can use that information to thwart the affirmative's purpose in trying to put a check upon him. First, we quote Aaron Vidalski, House Document 289, 1968. In foreign affairs, we may be approaching the stage where knowledge is power. Okay, here's the point of the argument, though. We quote Robert Dahl, Congress and Foreign Policy. It should not be overly difficult for the executive branch to create a crisis in foreign affairs by the release of appropriate information at its disposal. The point is simply this. If the executive wants to avoid the check, if he wants Congress to make a particular decision, he simply gives them the information he wants them to have upon which they will make that decision. He still controls the information machinery under the affirmative plan. Therefore, they can't effectively check him. He could determine what decisions would be made by the Congress. Let's look to the disadvantages to the affirmative proposal. Let me do what the gentleman of the affirmative team wanted first and indicate why I'm not contradicting John. John talked about inherency. He said inherently Congress could control the president in terms of structure, in terms of those powers of legislative writers, etc. I'm now going to indicate why, either under the present system or the affirmative plan, Congress should not check the president, and there are several disadvantages. The first disadvantage is that the affirmative proposal is inequitable. It's inequitable in terms of structure, it's inequitable in terms of representation, it's inequitable in terms of the party system. Let's talk about the reasons that structurally their proposal is inequitable in that they give the control to the Senate. The first reason is the tyranny of the minority. I quote Bernard Schwartz, professor of international relations at New York University, Power of Government, 1963. A group of senators who speak for only a small proportion of the American people effectively block a treaty desired by most of the country. Now, the fact that a minority can block a treaty is a flaw in the present system, granted, but the affirmative team is going to extend that flaw to all instances of intervention. What is the tyranny of the minority? It's the simple fact that in order to get something through the Senate, now under present rules, which the gentlemen keep, you've got to secure a 2/3 majority. So under the affirmative's plan, if 1/3 of the Senate plus one oppose that act of intervention that the majority of the people want, the will of the minority will win, because 1/3 of the Senate plus one managed to forestall that action. The second reason that their plan is structurally inequitable is simply the filibuster. They keep present rules. Under present rules, you can have filibusters in the Senate. The third reason their plan is structurally inequitable is because of the nature of the committee system. Now, granted, they're going to be having, in most instances, except when they need their emergency committee to meet, they're going to be having the Senate make the decisions. But the fact is, members of key committees that have attained a position of preeminent power within the Senate, can dictate what decisions that Senate makes. Let me quote Sheldon Appleton, professor of government at Oakland University, United States Foreign Policy, 1968. The power of the Appropriations Committee is especially formidable. Its decisions are rarely overruled on foreign or domestic matters. No congressman is eager to court the disfavor of a committee which may control the level of federal expenditures in his own district. The fourth and final reason their plan is structurally inequitable is because of the seniority system. We've said that these committees exercise undue control. Let's go within the committees and indicate that the man who's the most senior on that committee is the one that's going to decide what the committee does and how they influence the actions of the Senate. Let me quote Senator Robert Griffin of Michigan, We Propose a Modern Congress, 1966. Members of the majority of a committee are either in tune with the chairman's action or are extremely reluctant to challenge his authority. Let's now turn to the reasons that representationally the affirmative proposal is inequitable. What I'm going to say here is simply this. On the issue of foreign relations, Congress, the Senate being a part of Congress, does not reflect the wishes of the people. And if they're going to talk about representation, if they're going to say that the Senate plus the President are more representative, they've got to prove that the Senate is representative. Here's why. If we can prove the Senate doesn't represent the people, how can they tell you that combining the unrepresentative Senate with the representative President equals a more representative system? They can't do it. They are the ones in their own case, then, that assume that the Senate represents the wishes of the people in the area of foreign policy. Let me establish right now that they don't, and put up this stumbling block to their carrying that burden of proof. First, I quote Grant McConnell of the University of Chicago, The Modern Presidency, 1967. It would be comforting to assume that the many different positions that congressmen and senators take add up together to a position as national as the president's, but the president's constituency consists of all the people. Because the smaller constituencies emphasize particular interests, the aggregate representation offered by the Congress does not equal that of the presidency. At this stage, the argument is a well-supported generality. Let me make it more specific by quoting you a statistic. I'm quoting Professor N.C. Thomas, professor of political science at the University of Michigan, and Professor K. Lamb from the University of California at Santa Cruz. They're referring to a survey by the University of Michigan Survey Research Center. Listen to this statistic. I find it startling. the correlation of congressional roll call voting with constituency opinion was a negative .09 on the question of foreign involvement. A negative correlation between what the people want on foreign affairs and what the Congress votes on foreign affairs, and the gentlemen say that Congress is more representative, that they're going to have a more representative system by introducing Congress. We don't believe it. Representationally, that plan is inequitable. Let's look to the third reason it's inequitable. We're going to say this proposal is inequitable on the basis of the party system. Here I have two arguments reminding you that they're concerned with the party system when they talk about bipartisanship and when they talk about increasing the likelihood of public support. First reason it's inequitable on the basis of the party system is that the committee structure controls the party system. So we're indicating that this inequitable Congress we've been talking about controls the political parties. Once again, I quote Professor Appleton. American parties are decentralized, and congressional party leaders need the support of leading committee chairmen more than the latter need them. First reason on the party basis inequitable. The second reason is this. The Democrats are going to elect the Republican representatives on the affirmative plan. Startling? John asked them, are you going to elect the representatives by caucus or by the whole Senate? They answer the whole Senate. You get all the Senate together, all those Democrats, and they'll elect the Republican representatives to the affirmative plan, and the affirmative team tells you that's going to help the two-party system. John and I don't believe it. Okay, we've seen their proposal is inequitable structurally, representationally, and on the basis of the party system. Let's go a little bit further. We're going to say that this affirmative proposal is going to result in a less effective foreign policy. A less effective foreign policy. Let me begin by describing Congress in two ways. First, Congress lacks expertise in the area of foreign affairs. The simple fact is that a congressman is elected by such a small unit back home that he has to make his decisions about national security on the basis of the effect of those decisions on the little group back home. Once again, I quote Professor Colleget. In Congress, local and special interests are emphasized at the expense of national perspective and at the cost of an effective national strategic posture. The second description of Congress is that it lacks expertise in the area of foreign affairs. It lacks expertise. Here I quote Eleanor Lansing Dulles, a member of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, American Foreign Policy in the Making, 1968. Though the Senate and House share the responsibilities of the executive in shaping national policies, their members cannot have the day-to-day familiarity with policies of those who are constantly dealing with Washington agencies, diplomats, intelligence agents, and others involved in current programs. Okay, Congress doesn't have perspective, it doesn't have expertise. Let's give you an example of the kind of decision on national security that Congress makes by quoting Professor Colleget for the final time. Throughout the Korean conflict, many legislators worried more about the impact of defense spending on economic prosperity than about the political stakes of the armed struggle, both in Asia and Europe. Picture this. South Korea falling to communism, the balance of world power tipping, and Congress is worried about the effect of spending the money on the little defense plant back home. We say that kind of decision-making is going to result in a less effective foreign policy. John and I eventually will ask you to reject the affirmative proposal.
Size, I think that any comparison between me and myself and John Carson is sort of a compliment, and I'll take it as such, and I'll examine what I did say and see what the gentleman's responses were. I think there's some general lines of argumentation that finally come down to this first negative rebuttal that I really don't think the gentleman is particularly responsible to. Now let's talk about the first affirmative advantage. We're going to have a more effective check on the president. I agreed with the gentleman that resolutions weren't effective. Then I went to the second idea, the power of the purse. Now, number one, I suggested that if the Congress was really not worried about politics, not worried about losing their political scalp, they could go ahead and cut appropriations. But the gentlemen tell me they're worried about public opinion. What else could they be worried about withdrawing appropriations if they weren't worried about public opinion? I think the gentleman contradicts himself here, and he's going to have to make the point clear. But you know what's more important than that? I suggested a device. I'll admit it may not be the world's best device, but I think the gentleman should have been responsive to it. The legislative rider. A legislative rider is not an ex post facto check. It comes before the fact, and since I'm a Latin expert, I can't give you that. But I want to make this point clear. What did Mr. Appleton point out? That Congress can specifically say what funds are used for. You can say no gas, no airplanes, no troops, no nothing can go out of the United States without the approval of the Congress. That's exactly what Mr. Appleton said. The gentleman used my Mansfield example to get around the point. I was quoting Mr. Mansfield's possible application of this example. But remember what I said. They're going to have to prove that once we needed an effective check. Their only argument cannot be that we've never used this check. It's there to be used if the Congress wants it to be used. But what was the gentleman's response? If we adopt the affirmative checks, will adopt the affirmative plan. The negative checks will adopt the affirmative plan. That doesn't suggest an affirmative argument to me. It suggests negative inherency argument to me. That if you adopt what the present system is, you've got what the affirmative team is proposing, and I'll suggest that that's not much of a change. All right, let's go on to the next point. The idea of the legislative check and representation. Well, we've established once again that representation of the people is not what the gentlemen are considering. They're considering about 100 senators. Excuse me, more appropriately, 5 senators on the special committee that can give the approval to Congress. Now, I want you to realistically ask yourself who the 5 senators are going to be on that committee. I think if we turn to the congressional leadership, we'll get a pretty good example. Senator Mansfield, a good old friend of Lyndon Johnson. Senator Dirksen, an enemy of Lyndon Johnson? No. Senator Law, the whip of the Senate. Is he an enemy of Lyndon Johnson? I'll suggest not. And I could go through the entire leadership and suggest to you that these men would merely rubber stamp the issues. The gentlemen are talking about great crusaders, like Senator J. William Fulbright and Senator Morse. Now the gentlemen are going to have to tell me that these are the type of senators that would be elected to their committee in order for them to have a significant advantage in today's debate. All right. Now we talked about the idea of alternatives. And I pointed out this one thing. Alternatives are discussed within the executive branch. The gentleman said, no, we have to have them discussed within the congressional branch. What if the majority of the Senate has one opinion? It's just like the president having one opinion. All the alternatives of Senator Wayne Morse, all the alternatives of Senator J. William Fulbright don't amount to a hill of beans if a majority of the Senate is determined to vote right now to get what they want through. But if the gentlemen come back and tell me, no, that's not true, the Senate can filibuster forever, I'll suggest the gentlemen have a serious problem about the immediacy of response of the United States to communist attack. I'll suggest the gentlemen are on the horns of a dilemma here. Either we're going to have speed to meet the communists, or we're not going to have speed, and we're going to have a problem of getting the alternative views the gentlemen are interested in. And finally, what about bipartisan support? Here's the affirmative. On one hand, we're going to have a more bipartisan policy. But when I point out bipartisanship all the way is bad, they'll say, well, naturally, we're not doing away with everybody. All right, then. This is their burden of proof. How much is the difference between X and Y? How much is the significance of the affirmative advantage? If they're going to claim the best of both worlds, then they better tell me the significance of the best of both worlds. They better tell me the degree to which the affirmative plan changes things, and they haven't done it so far today. All right, what about the last issue in today's debate? Who will make a more representative decision? They said the the Senate plus the President. I suggested that the President, under the affirmative plan, would have to kowtow to the Senate, which only represents 30% of the American people in its majority. I don't care what the gentleman wrangle around the point coming home. The point still remains the same. He has to kowtow to the 51%. The gentleman never denied the point, and I think it's a valid point in today's debate.
The gentleman's alleged plan objections. Number one, he tells you that we have some solvency problems because the president controls public opinion. I suggest they ask Mr. Johnson whether or not that's true. Secondly, I would suggest that even if it were true, it's probably developed out of the situation that the public looks to the president because they realize their senators are impotent in the field of foreign policy. They don't have any say. I don't think it's a legitimate objection. Number two, he brought up a stellar point on information. He said, look, all of these people are going to be dependent upon the same information. Therefore, they're all going to reach the same decision, which makes just about as much sense as saying that all the judges in this round are going to hear the same information. Therefore, they're going to reach the same decision, and you and I both know how unrealistic that is. But secondly, it directly contradicts his colleague, because he told us about all the alternatives that were proposed in the Bay of Pigs, not the Bay of Pigs, but the Cuban Missile Crisis. If that's true, then how could all of the alternatives have been proposed if they all had the same information and all came to the same conclusion? I suggest he's inconsistent. Number three, he tells us that the president controls the information, therefore he's likely to slant it. First of all, I'm going to indicate that Congress has access to the information. Charles Derchik, professor of political science at Purdue, in his book Availability of Information for Congressional Operations, 1967. Committees having legitimate need for as much as classified information largely seems to have been able to gain access to it. The Congress can get it at the present time. But look what the gentlemen tell us. They tell us that the Congress is going to have access to all the information all along the line. Then the president is going to pop up and say, surprise, everything I've told you in the past 3 months has been a lie. This is the situation that exists today. I don't think that's very realistic. Secondly, it suggests we have a sneaky president. If we have a sneaky president, then we have to have the affirmative proposal to curtail him. Then the gentleman talked about the disadvantages. They said you were inequitable in your representation of the Senate. Here again, the gentlemen got themselves into a fantastic contradiction. What was the reason they told you that the Congress doesn't use the checks at the present time? Because they agree with the president. Isn't that right? What did they tell you next? Public opinion always goes along with the president. Well, if the public and the Congress both agree that the president is right, then how in the world can they tell us that it's not representative? I suggest the gentlemen have another contradiction. They wanted to talk about the tyranny of minority. I want them to relate that specifically to the commitment of troops, because I suggest to you that every person in this country has a vested interest in the commitment of troops. It doesn't make any difference if you happen to come to Arizona or from Oregon. Then he talked about filibusters. I thought this was pretty interesting. You know what his whole argument is predicated on? That the senators of the United States are going to be so crass, they're going to sell American national security down the tube just so they can take up time on the Senate floor with the filibuster. I don't think they ever justified that claim. Then he wanted to talk about some more disadvantages. He talked about the Senate not being representative. I've already dealt with that. Let me lump some of his arguments together, though, because I think they lend themselves well to that. He said them about 4 different times, 4 different ways. First of all, he talked about regional interest. Do congressmen have regional interest in foreign policy? He didn't say, I don't think so. Mr. Crabb of Vassar University, in his book American Foreign Policy in the Nuclear Age, the significant trend in the recent period is a growing unimportance of sectional and regional differences in public opinions towards foreign affairs. Secondly, he suggested that congressmen were unduly influenced by lobbyists, that they were going to spend their money in the defense plans. I suggest he didn't present you any documentation for that. Let's find out whether or not there's significant lobbies in the defense industry. Roger Hilsman of the Washington Institute for Foreign Policy Research. Congress has greater freedom in the field of foreign policy than is ordinarily supposed. For one thing, there seem to be relatively few pressure groups and interest lobbies at work on foreign policy. I suggest that doesn't apply. Finally, he said congressmen don't have the expertise that the executive branch has. First, it was kind of contradictory, you know, because President Johnson was a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 14 years. I suggest that's the place we get most of our presidents from. But secondly, let's examine whether or not we have experts in the Congress in the field of foreign affairs. Ernest Griffith, director of the Legislative Reference Service of Congress, in his book, Congress, Its Contemporary Role. The difference today is that Congress can face the State Department as its self-respecting equal, but its command of competence and expertise as well. I suggest they have the expertise. They had one more disadvantage. They talked about the party system controlling the committee system. They said the committee system was bad because all of the men on it were senile. I suggest that it doesn't apply to our proposal, certainly not our committee, because our committee isn't elected in the same way that their present committees are now. It's elected by the Senate peers. Secondly, if they want to suggest a policy going before the floor of the Senate, suggest that if it's in the field of military commitments, we'll go before the entire Senate. We won't have to go through the committee structure. No disadvantage. Let's get back to the affirmative rationale, because I think the gentlemen reduced themselves to several impotent arguments. They argue, number one, that we have checks at the present time because we can use that appropriations rider. It's law, and the president can't do anything but go along with it. Let me give you an instance where the president went against the law on the books. Francis Wormuth, professor of political science at Harvard. President Truman ordered the dispatch of American combat forces without seeking approval from Congress. The president acted in this fashion, despite the UN Participation Act, signed by law by Congress, which stipulated that any agreement by which the United States supplied troops to the UN must be approved by the Congress. I suggest if he could go against that law, then he can go against the law that they suggest. Why not institutionalize the check? Why not take the power away from the president to intervene in every situation? I suggest the gentlemen have tacitly agreed that would be a good idea because they recognize the efficacy of those checks. I suggest we adopt the affirmative proposal.
Ladies and gentlemen, since the first affirmative rebuttalist replied to only one of John's arguments, I'll cover that first, my own arguments, then I'll go back to the rest of what John said. All right, remember we indicated that a legislative writer right now structurally can control the president, to which the gentleman came back and said, but the president violates legislative writers. Notice the flaw in the case? What's to keep him from violating the law the affirmative team passes? I want them to answer that question. If the president can violate present laws, he can violate affirmative laws, reject the affirmative proposal because laws are ineffective. Let's talk about solvency. Number one, public opinion. They said, well, to ask Mr. Johnson if the president controls public opinion. I'm pretty good at flipping answers too. Ask Mr. Morse. Let's talk about executive having the same information. They said it doesn't make sense. People wouldn't have alternatives if everyone arrived at the same conclusion from the same information. I'm saying if they're reasonable after they've evaluated this evaluated the alternatives, they'll make the same decision. In fact, a case calling for deliberation in the legislature assumes that those men eventually will arrive at consensus. Third, the executive controls information, to which they read some evidence saying that the committees can get classified information. They didn't say the committees can get it if the president doesn't want it, but more importantly, they said, well, gee, the president doesn't lie and he isn't so sneaky. I'll contend he does. They said he did when they said he wanted to act without checks. Let's look to the disadvantages. What did they tell us here? They said that we contradicted ourselves when we said that the Congress represents public opinion, as does the president. Just a minute. And these disadvantages, I was talking in this solvency argument about the president controlling public opinion in time of crisis. I think they ignored that rather important fact. Let's see that they're inequitable structurally. First of all, they never did tell you that it doesn't take a 2/3 majority to pass a bill. Secondly, what they said was this: tell us that these men will be willing to sell America down the river just because they disagree with the policy that the Senate is passing. Well, if they're right that these men are going to have alternatives to present, surely these men are going to believe their alternatives are the right ones. Surely these men are going to be willing to fight to get their alternatives passed. But I think congressmen might be kind of willing to do things not particularly in the national interest. Remember the example of the Korean budget that the gentleman never even referred to? Let's talk about the committee structure. They said, well, we're not operating in committees, we're operating in the whole Senate. Well, I indicated when I presented the argument that the importance of the argument was that the committees affect the decisions of the whole Senate. The gentleman misconstrued my argument. Let's talk about seniority. They said, well, these men won't be senile. Granted, they won't be senile, but the men controlling the committees will be the men with the most seniority. Now, did the affirmative team ever tell you that by definition, the men with the most seniority are the men necessarily best qualified to make foreign policy decisions? No, they didn't. That was their burden of proof. They dropped that fourth reason structurally that it's inequitable. Let's talk about representation. Okay, first of all, they said, well, there are no regional interests in the area of foreign policy. Remember the startling negative 0.09 correlation card I read? I bet the affirmative remembered it, but they never responded to it. If there are no such interests, and if congressmen are so representative of the people in general on foreign policy, I want to know why there's a negative correlation between the way they vote and what the people want. Let's talk about lobbies. They said, well, gee, there are no lobbies. I didn't talk about lobbies. I talked about, in general, the domestic, little local interest of the constituents. That's not a lobby. That's what the man was sent there to represent. The fact that he was sent to represent such a small group takes away his perspective in foreign policy. Let's talk about the party system. They never told you that the committee system of Congress doesn't control the parties, and you know what? They never justified having the Democrats in the Senate elect the Republican members of their plan. Very interesting. Let's look at a less effective foreign policy. Perspective. They told us that Congress has expertise. If Congress has expertise, why did they slash the Korean War budget on the war budget or the defense budget on the eve of the Korean War? The gentleman never referred to that example. Next, let's talk about expertise. They said, well, Mr. Johnson had expertise. That's where we get our presidents out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Two answers. Number one, name another president, please, that was a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Number two, if we're going to flip things off with answers like that, like Mr. Johnson has expertise, I'll flip it off by saying Mr. Johnson's no longer on that committee. Let's look at John's argument. Okay, here's what we've got to say. We've indicated the power of purse can be effective by legislative writers. If those writers of law can be violated, the affirmative law can be violated, and it's going to take a shift for them to get out of that. Secondly, if they tell us that our checks that we advocate can now be attained, which they did, they're saying their plan is part of the present system. Rejected for that basis. Agree with the affirmative team. Let's talk about the 100 senators. I want you to remember one thing very important. 51 of those 100 senators can be elected by 30% of the American people. And until the affirmative team comes to absolute grips with that argument and disproves it, they'll never tell you that the Senate is any more representative or that throwing the Senate in with the president makes for anything that's more representative. Let's talk about alternatives. Remember, if all members of the Senate or the majority of the members of the Senate are of the same mind, the fact that the members of the minority have alternatives will be totally irrelevant because the majority can prevail without listening to those particular alternatives that come from the minority. Bipartisanship, we ask them if bipartisanship is necessarily good. We ask them to tell us the significant difference under their proposal. And finally, representation again. Remember, 51 of the 100 senators are elected by 30% of the American people, but the affirmative team says their plan is more representative. It's not, and on that main reason, we want you to reject it.
First, John indicated that the gentlemen were very, very inconsistent. In the first piece, it tells us the reason Congress doesn't use the checks even though they have them is because Congress goes right along and agrees with the president all the time. Then John said, how do you get all your disadvantages with a Senate so unrepresentative of the American people? And the gentleman refused to answer it. I submit then the gentleman's very, very inconsistent and doesn't want to try and get out of it. Let's talk about the disadvantages. The president controls public opinion, he says. John says, what about Vietnam, Mr. Johnson? They said, ask Mr. Morris. Okay, Mr. Morris was defeated by another dub, another person who opposed the war in Vietnam, Senator Packwood. The Vietnam issue wasn't even an issue in the senatorial race. I submit the gentleman's answer doesn't stand. But number two, John had another answer. He says the reason the public looks to the president is because the Senate has no power now, and the gentleman didn't respond. Let's turn to the disadvantage of information. He says Congress can't get the information. They already do, even in crisis situations, from the CIA. William Rayburn, former director of the CIA, ever since the CIA was first established, the director has been authorized and in fact directed to make complete disclosure of CIA activities and other information to special subcommittees in both the House, Senate, and the House. I suspect then the Senate gets the information. Let's turn now to whether or not the Senate is representative. First of all, it's inconsistent. Number two, they said the men controlling the committees have the most seniority and they're not very representative. John said, well, look, that's not our system. We're having all the senators to get together by secret ballot and elect the members of the committee. It'll probably be pretty representative. Second, he said there's a negative correlation between the votes on foreign policy and public opinion. John asked him, number one, to get out of the contradiction, and number two, relate that to troop commitment specifically, and the gentleman couldn't do either. Number three, he repeated his assertion that lobbies had a lot of influence. John said, right, on domestic matters they do. What about foreign policy? More specifically, what about troop commitments? And the gentleman didn't relate it. I don't think he did a very good job there in extending his analysis. Then he said Democrats are going to elect Republicans on the committee. I apologize if it wasn't clear. Probably it wasn't. The idea is, though, each party elects their own. It's the entire vote of the Senate to do it, though. All right, let's go on a little bit. Let's go back to the affirmative case. First of all, he tells us the committee is just going to rubber stamp the president's actions. All right, one of the examples he used was Senator Mansfield, who introduced a resolution in the Senate calling for senatorial approval of all troop commitments in the Senate, all troop commitments the president wanted to make. Senator Mansfield, I submit one of their own examples is one person who won't just rubber stamp the president. Senator Mansfield's gone very, very far in saying the Senate ought to have the final decision. I think the gentleman was incorrect. Then we had a lot of argument about which was the most effective check. That was the first comparative advantage. What did they say? Congress can use a check on appropriations. We said, right, nominally Congress has the power to do so. What's the disadvantage? The disadvantage is political suicide. Now, we didn't say that meant Congress would never use a check on appropriations. We said that would mean it wouldn't be as good a check as the one we're offering, because their check would mean political suicide for the senators. Our check would occur before the troops were sent overseas. We'd get out of that disadvantage of political suicide. That's why we have a comparatively more advantageous check. They had another example of a check. They said the legislative writer is before the fact, so that'd be a good check. I said, first of all, that legislative writer has no legal effect. The president isn't bound by it. So they said, look, the president can violate your proposal too. No, it's a constitutional amendment. He can simply be impeached if he does that. The point is, congressional resolutions, legislative writers have no legal effect. There's no way for the president of the United States to be bound by that congressional decision. Witness Korea, witness the fact that Senator Mansfield introduced another resolution. There's no way for Congress to check the president of the United States right now. Under our proposal, they'll have that way, constitutional amendment if it's necessary. What about the second comparative advantage? We said the affirmative proposal would better secure truly national foreign policy. All right, they asked us what's the significance. I thought I explained that in my last speech. The significance is national unity. I thought we all agreed that was a significant advantage. James Rosenau, Research Assistant, Center of International Studies at Princeton. American foreign policy will be more effective the greater the degree of consensus which prevails among national leaders. Senator Wayne Morris. Troops committed overseas by executive action alone lacks national unity, lacks national sanction, and may soon lack support in a foreign policy venture embarked upon without the formal participation of Congress. That's the advantage. That's the reason why we have a very significant advantage in that second comparative advantage. Then number two, they said, look, if Fulbright and Morris are outvoted, you won't get the discussions. Sure, we'll get the discussions of policy alternatives. They get a chance to debate the issue. They get a chance to expose their ideas. That's a heck of a lot better than the fact that none of these men are consulted. None of their advice is taken at all. Right now, we think we've got an advantage. At least they get to debate the issue. At least they get to vote. At least they get to make public pronouncements of what they believe in before we send the troops overseas and not after. Then we talked about the advantages of bipartisanship. All they asked was the significance. Go right back to national unity. That's significant. That's why we want bipartisanship. We think it's a good idea. Then we talked about which agency is the most representative of the public. He said the Senate majority can get elected by 30% of the people. I first of all said, so what? Nixon got elected by 42% of the people. There's not too much significant difference. But number two, I said, look, the salient point is who's most representative? The president acting by himself or the president in conjunction with the Senate? I don't think he addressed himself to that issue. More importantly, to quote Mr. Humphrey, who said that there's a great deal of public support for NATO, for the UN, for the Marshall Plan. Why? Because there was executive and legislative agreement on the policies. Both branches were consulted, both branches concurred. Ernest Griffith, when Congress endorses a foreign policy decision, along with that endorsement goes a sense of the support of the United people. We want the goal of national unity. We think it's an advantage to our proposal. We want a more effective check. We opt in for the adoption of the resolution.